To Sarge Arthur George Smith, soldier, citizen, scientist, and to all sergeants anywhen who have labored to make men out of boys. Robert Anson Heinlein. Part 1. The Helldivers Discourse. On February 8, 2024, squad-based PvE shooter Helldivers 2 was released to the gaming public at large to much fanfare and not a small amount of controversy. In addition to its fairly tight gameplay, cinematic style, and general ease of access, the game also came packaged with a somewhat familiar story. Pretty much anybody with an interest in sci-fi, and a birth year starting in 19, would recognize the franchise's extremely close similarities to Paul Verhoeven's 1997 adaptation of Starship Troopers. The setting in both stories is a dystopic, all-American flavored portrayal of fascism on a stellar scale. The people of Earth have finally broken the bounds of their own home solar system, but under the united aegis of a gray, totalitarian government that rules the people with an absolute fist. There are a plethora of differences, of course, more even than the bare minimum needed to keep both properties legally distinct, but without reservation they share the same vision, portraying a futuristic, fascistic society in lightly satirical terms while never quite denying that society outright. The satire is much, much more pronounced in Helldivers 2, which couches its message in extremely fun, extremely cinematic, and fantastically large-scale set-piece combat. The in-game world is also quite lore-dense and, quite clearly, the Super Earth armed forces are nothing more than brainwashed clone shock troops fired again and again into endless, bloody conflict. A moment's break in the combat, on ship or even on the planets, might reveal the general unease and confusion with which the general public views the ongoing conflicts and suggestions of rebellions occurring just out of frame. Even the missives from the Super Earth government, the shadowy body controlling the war effort on multiple fronts, seem to, at times, echo a lack of surety and purpose in the ongoing conflict. This provides us with an inherent contradiction woven into the fabric of Helldivers 2. Is there something morally dubious about cosplaying fascism while I'm playing a game or talking about it? My answer is no, and we can get that out of the way now to better focus on the true crux of this video, the off-balance discourse that followed Helldivers 2's release. In the weeks following February 8th, in all the usual places you'd expect, various political actors on the right and the left began sticking their goofy little flags all over any discussion of Helldivers 2. I won't get into the myriad of arguments on both sides of the spectrum because, quite frankly, there's just no time, and no single person I've seen perfectly represents the general, by which I mean most common and least fucking insane, through line on any part of the political spectrum. But it boils down to this. On the left, the discourse has generally been that Helldivers 2 is a satire, which, to a degree, it is. And that Helldivers 2 shows fascism in a bad light one would be insane to not see. To a lesser extent, this is couched in a suggestion that enjoying Helldivers, or doing a bit of the old LARP about managed democracy, might in fact be a bad thing, or at least suggest you're going down a bad road. For individuals not fully on board with this assessment of the situation, the general reactions have ranged from exasperated non-concern to outright embrace of the thematic fascism. This created, by my observations, a conversational dead zone where purists of the online lefty camp clapped each other, and themselves, on the back for understanding satire and calling out fascism, with little concern for actually convincing the unconvinced. While lefties congratulated themselves for accomplishing literally nothing, actual fascists got to work framing them as pedants and buzzkills. Within just a few weeks, the conversation slowly turned from leftists are buzzkills, without irony, that's the case so fucking often, you can generally just assume it's right, sans evidence, to the left hates humanity. Wait, what? Yes, the left hates humanity, as in all human life. And without reservation, this wasn't a massive stretch, given how reactionary leftist voices tried to frame the conversation around their surface level and oftentimes literally incorrect understanding of Helldivers' spiritual source material. The 1997 Paul Verhoeven adaptation of Starship Troopers, a movie that internet lefties have for about a decade now, adopted as a hallmark entry of anti-fascist satire. I've seen a figurative, orbital barrage of bad takes, hot takes, and mistakes presented about the film and its novel source material, but more about that later. since the release of Helldivers 2. These include film theory grade conspiracism, things like the bugs being inherently peaceful and non-threatening, or the attack on Buenos Aires being a false flag, misconceptions about exactly what decisions Verhoeven made to articulate the fascism in the film, especially around the supposedly Aryan casting, and a plethora of other pedantic, bizarre, and at times counterfactual ideas about what the movie contains or intended to contain. Things like the fact that, well, Verhoeven didn't write Starship Troopers as a satire. Because Verhoeven didn't write Starship Troopers. Would you like to know more? Part 2. Satire, Fascism, and $100 Million Bugs. The production of Starship Troopers began roughly 6 years before its release, and at the time had next to nothing to do with Paul Verhoeven. According to The Making of Starship Troopers, an in-depth behind-the-scenes book written by Paul M. Salmon, a still photographer who worked on Starship Troopers, that covers the film's production from inception to just shy of release. Pre-production actually began with a concept script from a former Verhoeven collaborator, Austrian-born Ed Neumeier, at the time about 34 and just a few years removed from the massive success of RoboCop, which he wrote with Michael Miner, Verhoeven directing. Having since then split with Miner, Neumeier had been working on a story treatment called Bug Hunt at Outpost 7. I wanted to do a big, silly, jingoistic, xenophobic, let's go out and kill the enemy movie, and I had settled on the idea that it should be against insects. Neumeier said in a 1996 interview for the Los Angeles Times by writer David Kroenke. I wanted to make a war movie, but I also wanted to make a teenage romance movie. Neumeier bounced the idea to John Davison, who'd also worked as a producer on RoboCop in 1987 and particularly liked the idea as a reason to work with Phil Tippett, who had also worked on RoboCop. He animated the ED-209 in that movie, but you also might recognize his work from the little space chess guys in Star Wars or from his slightly more psychotic film, Mad God. With these ideas, but not Tippett yet, he'd be brought on sometime later, Davison brought Neumeier and his script treatment to TriStar Pictures executive Chris Lee, who shot them down. Neumeier's all-original IP just didn't have the oomph needed to push it into the studio system, it seemed. But almost as quickly as they were denied, Davison came up with the idea to merge Neumeier's Bug Hunt with a strikingly similar story written by sci-fi royalty, that being, of course, Starship Troopers by Robert Heinlein. We'll get into the breakdown of Heinlein's Troopers later in this video, but suffice to say, the most essential premises between Bug Hunt and Troopers were fairly similar. Space Marines fighting off massive waves of superbugs on distant planets. With some finagling, the two returned to Lee and eventually got the tentative okay to begin work on an adaptation of Heinlein's Troopers. From there, Neumeier goes to work on the script. Davison goes to enlist Tippett to make some big, scary bugs, and it's not until 1993 that they finally approach Verhoeven with an outline. Because I think Paul basically likes these kind of films, said Davison in an interview with Paul M. Salmon in Salmon's The Making of Starship Troopers. Take the Ray Harryhausen classics. Those are a part of Paul's filmic vocabulary. Plus, I was sure he'd be intrigued by a large-scale science fiction action picture that had a serious political undertone to it. I need to pause here to note the incredible work of Paul M. Salmon, who put together what is without a doubt the most comprehensive behind-the-scenes look at Starship Troopers that exists. Any of the in-depth coverage of Verhoeven's adaptation I've seen references Salmon heavily and with good reason. He was, quite literally, on set for nearly the entirety of the production and painstakingly interviewed nearly every person associated with the creation of Starship Troopers. All that said, Verhoeven was intrigued. Verhoeven was also busy. Despite his fairly massive success with RoboCop in '87 and the Arnold Schwarzenegger on Mars sci-fi classic Total Recall in 1990, Verhoeven was going through a downswing. He'd followed those two films up with the well-received, though highly sexual and decidedly non-sci-fi, Basic Instinct in 1992. Either way, Paul Verhoeven was extremely influential for nearly half a decade in Hollywood, but things were waning. For whatever reason, two massive pictures he'd been slated to run fell through. A lady pirate adventure called Mistress of the Seas for Columbia, and a crusade epic called Crusade from Carolco Pictures starring Arnold fucking Schwarzenegger. The first draft script for Troopers was finished July 8, 1993, around 3 years before principal photography would start on April 19, 1996. Those interim years were filled with a myriad of pre-production elements, from monster and costume design to the development of what would become massive stunts and set pieces. And, of course, casting, but we'll get to that. Neumayer's original script, by his own account, was as close as he could cut it to the original novel, which presented a series of challenges and difficulties. What I really liked about the idea of this movie was that it allowed me to write about fascism, Neumayer says in Salmon. That's amusing. It was also difficult to do, or to do well. Paul Verhoeven had an enormous influence on that angle of the picture, once he became more actively involved. But right from the start, I had a feeling that today's film audiences would really appreciate Heinlein's ideas, because the message of the original book was pretty straightforward. Democracy is failing, and we need some strict controls on our culture. I retained that outlook in the ST scripts, but I also wanted to play with it. To me, the whole spin of the movie is this. You want a world that works? Okay, we'll show you one. So, where's the satire, you might be asking? Well, it's not there yet, nor will you quite see it arrive anytime soon. As far as the politics of Heinlein's Starship Troopers, which even Neumayer at this point admitted seeing as fascist, they kept them in. Not only kept them in, but cleared them as well with Virginia Heinlein, Robert's widow, who you'll see later in this video pretty much co-signs all his politics, but particularly those that led to the writing of Starship Troopers. During the creation of the first draft, in fact, the most important aspect of the adaptation was to, essentially, invert the overall construction of Heinlein's novel. We're going to go over that in full in this video, and boy, are we ever. But here's the cliff notes so that you understand the general gist of things. Johnny Rico is the main character, and the book starts in a similar fashion to the movie, with a mobile infantry invasion of a distant planet. It's not a bug planet, and not Clendathu in the novel. That comes later, but the setup of an initial action set piece shown in medias res is the same. We then snap back several years to Johnny in high school and travel through his enlistment, basic training, and then re-arrive back at the failed Battle of Clendathu and move on to the aftermath. In the book, it's Johnny's term in officer candidate school, and in the movie, a few set-piece fights. But eventually we arrive at, basically, the mission to take the brain bug and then the end of the book and film. There are numerous differences, which I'll get into, but the most notable of them is what I'll call the Neumayer romance. That is, the inclusion of a series of doe-eyed high school romances between members of the main cast that serves as an emotional bridge between the failed Clendathu invasion and the capture of the brain bug. More so than the other issue, this was the largest obstacle to overcome in adapting Heinlein's Troopers to the silver screen. The other major headache we inherited from Heinlein's novel was structural, David says in Salmon. Heinlein's Starship Troopers has a strong first and third act, but most of the middle portion of the novel, the part where Johnny Rico is in boot camp, is basically a tract. Heinlein is preaching to his readership there. Well, that's fine for a book, but not necessarily the sort of thing that a major studio is going to invest millions of dollars in. And I agree, to an extent. There is certainly no way to directly turn Heinlein's novel into a standard Hollywood movie beat for beat. As you'll see when we break it down, Heinlein's Troopers is more of a series of treatises and meditations on the nature of soldiering, troop leadership, and the development of young people set against the backdrop of a society that best exemplifies the ideals Heinlein himself believed would create the best practices necessary to achieve those ends. It's very complicated, as you'll see during the novel breakdown. But also, if you think that description of Heinlein's novel sounds like it wouldn't make for good reading, you're in good company with Verhoeven. He's never read the thing either. I stopped after 2 chapters because it was so boring, Verhoeven said in an October 2014 interview with Empire by Adam Smith and Owen Williams. It really is quite a bad book. I asked Ed Neumayer to tell me the story because I just couldn't read the thing. It's a very right-wing book. And with the movie we tried, and I think at least partially succeeded, in commenting on that at the same time. It would be eat your cake and have it. All the way through we are fighting with the fascism, the ultra-militarism. All the way through I wanted the audience to be asking, Are these people crazy? Note that's nearly 20 years down the line of when Paul M. Salmon interviewed him for the making of Starship Troopers. There's a fairly common repeating pattern that emerges when you see interviews about the film in the 90s versus after it garnered cult status going into the 2010s. It might just be feeling free to talk about a long-completed project versus trying to sell it while you're making it, or a growing appreciation for the views of a newly outspoken anti-fascist audience on the internet. Or both. Or neither. Either way, you can see the difference somewhat plainly in the way Neumeier and Heinlein talk about the film. No, I purposefully stopped reading Starship Troopers after the first 40 pages, because I thought, this is not the story I want to do, Verhoeven says in an interview with Salmon. Further clarifying his thoughts on Heinlein's fascism, he continues, so I think the essence of my interest in this so-called fascism of Heinlein's, or pseudo-fascism, the real reason I wanted to transfer that to film was that at this moment there are voices in the United States that would actually embrace this form of policy. Which is another reason I wanted to do this film, to carry over the fascist framework from the book to the movie. It's a metaphor, you see, for that part of the American society which would like to have something like the government portrayed in Starship Troopers in power in the United States today. It would also be interesting, I felt, to have the film of Starship Troopers make this statement. This quasi-fascist society we're showing you works. On a certain level, anyway. This idea, showing you a society that works, is repeated throughout Salmon's book, essentially highlighting the most peculiar aspect of Verhoeven's adaptation of Starship Troopers and my largest contention with the film. Not only does it show a society that works, it shows a society that appears to be, for all intents and purposes, thriving. There is no real sense of infringement on human rights, at least on par with the sense of fascism, i.e. the National German Socialism or Nazism that Americans would associate with that word. There is no sense of need or want. Scientific advancements in medicine have created fully functional robot limbs, spaceships that travel the cosmos, and a stable meritocratic job market. Even the military service is optional, and it's shown that not having franchise, being recognized as a citizen and being able to vote, isn't that big of a deal. So much so that the main character's father, an affluent business owner, doesn't see much value in risking one's life to obtain that right. The Earth of ST is a bit like the Singapore of today, said production designer Alan Cameron in an interview with Salmon. People living there, although they are individuals, are very oriented towards society. There's no sort of antisocial behavior, there's no graffiti, there's no litter on the ground. So our future Earth is crisp and green with pure colors. From there, it followed that the architecture on our Earth would also be very pure, very formal, and very manicured. In fact, throughout this picture, I've tried to subtly suggest that the Earth of Starship Troopers is, in effect, a planet-wide military base. Earth's culture as portrayed in Starship Troopers is a very cleaned-up society, Verhoeven says in an interview with Salmon, where kids, instead of asking for drugs, are asking for a kiss. I mean, there is really no criminality visible anymore. Everything is pure. Everybody has uniforms. It's a very disciplined society where basically people can say to each other, I love you. Verhoeven made a great deal of changes both to Neumeier's script and the overall character of Starship Troopers before the first day of filming. Most controversially, at least at the time, nobody but sci-fi diehards and Heinlein fans seem to know this now, he removed Heinlein's power armor. Yes, power armor. All the power armor you've ever loved, Fallout, Warhammer 40k, Halo, Doom, StarCraft, all those iterations of power armor are likely derived either firsthand or otherwise from Heinlein's massively popular novel. Verhoeven also dumbed down Heinlein's pseudo-arachnids, the bugs of both the film and the book, in which they're depicted as being extremely intelligent, organized, and technologically advanced. The reason they're so dangerous in Heinlein's Troopers is because they've got laser weapons that can easily dice up a mobile infantryman, power armor or not. They also use spaceships, not the biological plasma seen in the movie, to achieve interplanetary travel. Which is why there's no speculation about the assault on Buenos Aires in the books. It just happens. No, the most important and most iconic addition, alteration, what have you, that Verhoeven made in his adaptation was the internet age update of a device he'd been using since RoboCop. Commercial breaks. A DOS web version of a browser beaming pure, hot, concentrated propaganda to the United Citizens Federation's humble masses. But what if I told you that propaganda, ridiculous as it is in universe, didn't just work there? Would you believe me if I told you it worked on you too? Would you like to know more? Part 2.2. Paul Verhoeven's Starship Troopers. Paul Verhoeven's Starship Troopers begins in much the same fashion as its spiritual filmic predecessor, RoboCop, with the commercial. We see a splash of the FedNet logo and are then introduced to a series of rapid-fire expository sequences that frame our narrative and get a lot of the rough stuff out of the way. First, there's a military recruitment ad that tells you young people from all over the globe are joining up to fight for the future. It makes a tongue-in-cheek joke about child soldiers with a little kid hopping in to parrot the line, "I'm doing my part," and ends with the Federation's heartline slogan, "Service guarantees citizenship," establishing the inherently martial nature of this future society. We see this usage of sloganeering throughout Verhoeven's work, but especially in Starship Troopers with its emphasis on a Leni Riefenstahl-influenced propaganda. Service guarantees citizenship. Would you like to know more? The only good bug is a dead bug. A sort of militaristic call and response that is, pun not intended, echoed throughout Starship Troopers, often in dual-use cause and effect scenarios. Phrases like, "Until I'm dead or you find someone better," "Come on, you apes, you want to live forever?" and the Roughnecks slogan, "Radchak's Roughnecks," and then Rico's Roughnecks, hammer home a sense of not just propagandistic militarism, but also cultural inheritance. A not merely societal but professional tradition that extends from our first glimpses of Rico and Radchak in moral history and philosophy class to Rico's battlefield euthanasia of Radchak at the height of the movie's largest set-piece moment in the second act climax. This Riefenstahl quality is intentional. Riefenstahl is, for those few wondrous, innocent souls who've never had to sit through some of her profoundly stunning, profoundly boring films, was the veritable queen of Nazi propaganda. Her 1934 film, Triumph of the Will, is unquestionably one of the most successful and best recognized acts of propaganda of the 20th century. Though by modern standards it's somewhat dated, its photography and editing techniques, interspersing sweeping emotional shots of the 1934 Nazi Congress in Nuremberg with rousing photography and audio of speeches, were cutting edge at the time. This sense of overwhelming scale and organization, of enormous organized crowds and fervent political rhetoric informed much of Verhoeven's vision for the imagery of Starship Troopers. Many of the sequences in Starship Troopers featuring the masses of soldiers are Leni Riefenstahl, Verhoeven says in Salmon. It's just copying from Triumph of the Will, in a certain way, of course, in a free way. But again, these sequences are also saying, this is the society we're talking about. Do you like it or not? Again, that concept. Do you like it or not? It gets repeated throughout, especially the earliest discussions of Starship Troopers when it comes to the portrayal of the United Citizen Federation. The unified, heavily militaristic stratocracy that controls all of the planet Earth and a growing share of the galaxy at large. A stratocracy is when the military openly controls administration of both the government and itself. Following the first FedNet section, we switch seamlessly into a decidedly not Riefenstahlian Steadicam shot of the first Battle of Klendathu, where human forces are in the midst of being routed by the bugs. In wondrous, gory first person, we're shown the absolute annihilation of FedNet's on-the-ground reporter in a midnight battlefield strewn with the corpses of the UFC's mobile infantrymen. Among them is Johnny Rico, our main character, who we'll be better introduced to in a bit, though this scene ends with the strong implication he might be dead. Spoiler. Of course, he doesn't die, but we don't find that out until much later. At this point, Verhoeven takes us back in time several months to Exposition High, where we're more fully introduced to UCF society, its ongoing conflict with the pseudo-arachnids, our bugs, from the start of the film, and, of course, our cast. Casper Van Dien plays lead as Johnny Rico, a soon-to-graduate and enlist, blonde-haired, blue-eyed high school jock living in Buenos Aires. He's a visual ubermensch, which has created a subtext in more than a few online discussions of Starship Troopers that he and the other three leads, Neil Patrick Harris, Jake Busey, and Denise Richards, are supposed to suggest the UCF is an intentionally Aryan construct, but that's not the case. So why do all these leads have that Germany 1938 vibe? Why would white people in Buenos Aires have Latino last names? It was just a casting choice, and the nature of who was getting on television in the 1990s. When we first began casting, we looked around for big stars in their late teens to early 20s, because the majority of the principal characters in Starship Troopers fall into that age group. Verhoeven explains in Salmon. In Heinlein's novel, Juan, Johnny, Rico is a proud Filipino and isn't even from Buenos Aires. Carmencita Ibanez, called Carmen in the Verhoeven adaptation and played by Denise Richards, and Carl, Johnny's best friend who has almost no presence in the book, played by Neil Patrick Harris, both grew up with Johnny and are very likely Filipino as well. So why not hire Filipinos, or any Latinos at all, for the role? Because Verhoeven had to take what he could get. We discovered that either the actors in that area were already working, or more importantly, that they didn't really exist in that age group. Verhoeven says in Salmon, most of the really big stars today are already in their 30s or older, so we had to make a lot of our own stars. The most important adult roles in Starship Troopers were those of Sergeant Zim, a mobile infantry drill sergeant played by Clancy Brown. For all you Zoomers out there, that's the voice of Mr. Krabs from SpongeBob SquarePants. And Gene Radchak, played by Michael Ironside, a frequent Verhoeven collaborator. The Radchak role is notable in that it's a combination of a character you experience more as a ghost in Heinlein's novel, Lieutenant Radchak, referred to mostly as the Lieutenant, and Jean V. Dubois, Book Rico's moral history and philosophy teacher. We'll return to Radchak shortly because this character is incredibly important to both stories. While these role model adult characters are crucial to the plot, they don't have anywhere near the screen time or overall importance in the hierarchy of characters to draw in A-list actors, which put Verhoeven in an impossible situation. You see, in 1996, you could not rely on word of mouth and viral marketing, which really didn't even exist, to sell AAA productions to the average American. You needed stars, celebrities with an existing profile people would want to see, and who would grab people's attention when they appeared on late-night shows to shill the movie to Jay Leno or David Letterman. While the internet and cable were getting bigger at the time, people in the 90s mostly learned about upcoming releases through just a few mediums. Interview shows, ads on television, in newspapers, and on billboards, and by seeing trailers and posters at the theater when they saw other movies. Verhoeven needed an impossible mix of attributes for the cast of his film. Relevant, young, and uncommitted actors who had enough profile to sell the movie and who also would be willing to take a chance on a strange sci-fi war film by a director recently known for highly sexualized projects. What Verhoeven and his casting director settled on were television stars. Van Dien had been in a slew of television shows, including Beverly Hills 90210. Denise Richards, much the same, had appeared on episodes of numerous shows, including Beverly Hills 90210, and Doogie Howser, MD, appearing in the episode Doogstruck in 1992 opposite that series' lead, Doogie Howser himself, Neil Patrick Harris. Harris was, by far, the largest name attached to the main cast at the time, and even then his last major role as the prodigy child actor was a few years behind him, closing its 4-year run in 1993. This lack of notoriety, and to a lesser degree, talent, amongst the main cast of the film would eventually become part of the given explanation as to why Verhoeven's adaptation failed. But as for why Verhoeven chose a generally Aryan-coded main cast, well, it all comes down to money and the fact that, in the early 90s, there was a specific type of person Hollywood often picked to get famous in television. with $100 million in budget on the line, and the largesse of that tied up in extremely complicated props and digital and practical effects. Verhoeven took what he got and, in my opinion, got a lot out of it. One of the other reasons I get into this is that some internet speculators have suggested that the cast was specifically chosen because they had a perfect mix of dopey hotness and Nazi-adjacent chic. That's simply not the case, or if it happens to be, isn't something I found largely discussed in any of the source materials from the time of production. Neumeier's script was simply written around a dopey high school romance, and so that's the role the actors they could find played. Not really much more to it on that front, and honestly, I think much of the heat the actors get for being dopey is more attributable to Neumeier's writing than some esoteric game of 5D chess Verhoeven was playing with the audience. Anyway, back in class with Johnny, we meet Jean Radchak, again played by Michael Ironside. As mentioned before, this character is a mixture in name of two characters in the book, Lieutenant Radchak and Jean V. Dubois. But honestly, he's more of a summation of the primary through line of Heinlein's novel. There are a series of characters we'll talk about during the book discussion who essentially guide Rico on his journey to better understanding his roles as an infantryman and a member of society, the infantry's role in society, and society's role in the lives of citizens who, like Johnny, may one day join the infantry. This cycle is only just alluded to in the movie in comparison to the book, in which it accounts for essentially everything that's not power armor and Johnny checking out girls and other guys' jewelry. Radchak sums it up here in the movie in his explanation of civilians versus citizens. Everybody is born into the UCF as a civilian, with all the rights as citizens save the right to vote or hold office. This is amended later in a movie-only throwaway line by a female trooper suggesting only citizens have the right to have more than 2 children, which is literally antithetical to Heinlein's book and never canonically established by any other event. Citizenship is granted only at the end of a term of federal service. There's a bit of go-between here between Radchak and his students that mirrors the same event in the book, essentially giving him a chance to reprimand a soft-hearted liberal about her reticence to engage in violence. It's here we get, in my mind, an example of the most fundamental differences between Verhoeven's adaptation and the novel. In the movie's classroom scene, Radchak opines that someone should have told the city fathers of Hiroshima that violence never solves anything. Probably this was changed for the benefit of American audiences who would very much know, and likely have some opinion on, the atomic bombing of Hiroshima in World War II. Regardless of your opinions at the time in the 1990s, the general consensus amongst your average American was that the atomic bombing of the Japanese mainland was necessary to end the war with Japan, and that regardless of the human toll in the moment, the act possibly saved millions of American and Japanese lives. But in the book, Jean V. Dubois alludes not to the city fathers of Hiroshima, but of Carthage, which completely changes the context of that quote. Carthage, unlike Hiroshima, wasn't a city, but a city-state. The term denotes a now somewhat archaic form of governmental organization where a territory was controlled by a single city that often formed the social, economic, and political hub of the territory. Thus, when the city fell, the administrative state fell as well. This is crucial in that, first, Hiroshima never held a similar status, even going back into the heart of Japanese history. Nor was it ever such an especially vital town that its annihilation alone would spell the end of Japan, thus the follow-up bombing of Nagasaki. Carthage was considerably different. To grossly summarize the Punic Wars, they were a series of conflicts and 3 literal wars between the city-state of Carthage, which you may or may not have heard of, and Rome, between the years of around 264 BC to 146 BC. The Second Punic War alone stretched roughly 17 years and ended in Carthaginian surrender. Carthage, a major port city in what we now call Tunisia, followed up this defeat by becoming insanely wealthy through trade and general good management. Rome did not like this. Specifically, a veteran of the Second Punic War and extremely influential Roman senator and statesman named Marcus Porcius Cato, or Cato the Elder. He's called Cato the Elder because basically there are two Catos famous and influential enough in Roman history to be referred to by a single name. Cato the Younger is notable for literally fighting Gaius Julius Caesar to keep the dictator from taking control of Rome, to further establish the pedigree of this family. Cato the Elder was not a fan of Carthage. Their massive financial recovery following a war that, depending on who you ask, Rome kind of barely won thanks to Scipio Africanus, deeply concerned Cato the Elder. He feared their increasing wealth would embolden them to one day throw off the yoke of concessions Rome had wrapped around their neck at the end of the last war, or even simply attack Rome herself. Thus, it is said, Cato the Elder ended every speech in front of the Roman Senate with some variant of the phrase, Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed, and he meant it. And it was well known even in Carthage that Roman antagonism toward the city-state had not faded. But the city fathers of Carthage were hesitant to engage, or even really prepare, for all-out combat against the now military superior Rome. Rome eventually found her casus belli following a failed Carthaginian attack on Numidia, a Roman ally, who had been blatantly raiding into Carthaginian territory. Rome took over Utica, a nearby port city with clear intentions to invade. Now, here is why a simple line like the city fathers of Carthage is so important. Carthage, instead of battening down the hatches and preparing to fight, attempted acts of appeasement toward Rome. They executed the general who'd led the attack on Numidian lands, Hasdrubal, and after Rome landed, they disarmed their city by sending weapons, armor, and even their naval fleet to Utica, where the Romans burned it. Then the Romans told the Carthaginians, "We're still burning your city to the ground, so you can leave or you can die." The Carthaginians finally voted to act in defense of their city, but by then it was too late, and Rome began a 3-year siege of an extremely vulnerable Carthage. The siege ended in the razing of the city, the mass enslavement of their population, and the absorption of all Carthaginian lands and holdings into the Imperium of Rome. The Romans declared that region the Roman province of Africa after that. That act of appeasement, instead of preparation, of foolhardy politicking in the face of imminent annihilation, was the very reason Robert Heinlein wrote Starship Troopers. I'll cover it more extensively in the book breakdown, but suffice to say, he was a touch concerned in the mid-late 1950s about appeasement of the then ever-growing Soviet and communist Chinese empires, whose values were so antithetical to American ideals of liberalism and freedom, he believed, that they would sooner annihilate the United States, its allies, and the Earth itself than permit the US to coexist peacefully. This subtle misunderstanding of the concept of via victis, or woe to the conquered, where it is no longer a warning against weakness but rather a gross exaltation of strength, removes at once the moral constraint of Heinlein's novel in favor of a sort of social glorification of mass violence against civilians. What Verhoeven has done, in essence, is not simply misunderstand Heinlein's approach to social construction, but rather created a social narrative more amenable and flattering to both fascism and American exceptionalism. The scene also fails to address the clear moral issues of Hiroshima or the espoused mentalities in any substantive way, which is a running theme throughout the entirety of Verhoeven's adaptation. A constant return to a society that works, while never establishing in any valuable way how it might not. After that specific scene, we're in all new territory compared to Heinlein's material, and honestly, a lot of it has literally nothing to do with niche politics or fascism in any but the most facile sense. We're treated to a very cool scene back in Exposition High where Denise Richards spits up a mouthful of oatmeal into a dissected bug in a class taught by Rue McClanahan, dressed up as Dr. Strangelove. Yes, that Rue McClanahan. It teaches us that bugs move through space by spitting their spore through the cosmos on rocks and basically hoping for the best. This is a good lead-in to address another conspiracy theory that paints Verhoeven's adaptation as a masterwork of satire, but doesn't seem to be grounded in any observable fact. In Heinlein's novel, the bugs have spaceships on par with human technology and engage in interplanetary colonization that way. But in the Verhoeven adaptation, the bugs travel light years between planets via a vague, hand-waved system of biological plasma ejection and putting eggs on rocks. The absurdity of the new system, which only exists because Verhoeven nixed bugs using guns and spaceships in his adaptation, is so stupid that people have developed some wild fan theories around it. In particular, that the attack on Buenos Aires later in the film was a false flag operation conducted by the UCF, and that the UCF is seeding colony worlds with bugs for some clandestine purpose. There's essentially no canon evidence of either of these conspiracies in the Verhoeven adaptation aside from the simple inanity of the bugs traveling through such a method, and my searches through Salmon and other ancillary material have turned up nothing. We blow through Johnny's last day or week at Exposition High. We meet Dizzy Flores, my first crush ever when I was like 10, and she's into Johnny and he's not into her because he likes Carmen, but she's a career girl, and eventually she hooks up with the other guy in these scenes who's not remotely in the book. Who cares? As stated before, Neumeier's love quadrangle subplot is basically there to span the great divide of non-plot that makes up most of the Heinlein novel, and thus feels very bolted on in a narrative sense. We get the famous scenes with Carl doing telepathy on his ferret. I've seen people say the mind reading is fake in universe. I don't think that's necessarily the case. In the book, there is a sort of ESP power shown off for a brief second near the end that is real, but I guess it seems hokey, so maybe Carl is just making it up. Eventually, they go enlist in the military, and we meet a former mobile infantryman who tells the teens, "The mobile infantry made me the man I am today," before revealing he's a combat amputee. Carl goes to military intelligence, Carmen goes to Fleet Academy, and Johnny goes 03 infantry. Johnny tries to get Carmen to say she loves him, and she doesn't, which is hilarious, and they all make a saccharine promise that they'll always be friends. We see some more FedNet commercials, one with kids with guns, another wondering if you might be psychic, a newsreel about Mormon extremists being slaughtered on the faraway planet of Dantana, which is just a picture of another set you'll see later. That's why everybody gets confused about whether or not our characters go to Dantana in this movie, and an ad for a televised public execution. Very cool. Fun fact, if you have problems with the script for this movie, well, there's your writer, Ed Neumeier, getting set up to be hung for whatever those mean old UCF beasties dreamed up. In the book, the only public execution that's carried out is for a convicted child murderer and rapist who'd deserted from Johnny's boot camp training battalion before they'd even gotten started. Speaking of which, we go to boot camp. Space boot camp, which includes getting your ass beat by Clancy Brown, some fun knife exercises, and all gender nude showers. I know I said I watched this movie when I was like 10, and I stand by that age. I swear to God, I don't even remember seeing this as a child, and it might be that I saw an edited version of the film on like Sci-Fi or something, but they keep all the blood and stuff in on those channels, so thank God for that. Anyway, funny story about the all-gender showers and gender in general in Heinlein's novel. All that's a Verhoeven thing. Heinlein's novel has an extremely strict, but also very matriarchal gender separation between men and women. The entire infantry is male, because boys strong, and basically the entire naval officer staff and all the pilots are female, which means throughout Heinlein's novel, Johnny is outranked by essentially every woman in uniform he meets, including Carmen. Regardless, one of the most notable scenes in the Verhoeven adaptation is this mixed gender shower scene, which is sort of Verhoeven's take on futuristic gender norms. According to interviews Salmon did with the cast, it was certainly a weird day, but Verhoeven did his best to make it, if not less weird, more egalitarian. But when it finally came time to do it, some of us were still jittery. Paul Verhoeven was just great though, he really calmed us down, said Dina Meyer, who plays Dizzy, in an interview with Salmon. She continues this thought a bit further in the interview. He'd handled the situation so well that most of us sort of looked at each other and smiled and got out of our clothes pretty quickly. Verhoeven closed the set to just himself, the actors, and cinematographer Jost Vecano. Fun fact, Jost Vecano also did cinematography on RoboCop and, in 1981, German U-boat drama Das Boot. Hilarious fact, The cast decided before filming the scene that Verhoeven and Vacano shouldn't be the only ones wearing clothes, and after some light cajoling, the director and the cinematographer got naked too. Vacano is a, at the time, 60-year-old German guy, by the way. Salmon asked star Casper Van Dien how he felt about the scene as well. How did it feel to be naked around all those people during the shower scene? Van Dien said, "It felt wet." The boot camp scenes take up the rest of the first act. We see Rico and Flores distinguish themselves amongst the other cadets, with Johnny performing some of those space football acrobatics from high school during a laser tag firing exercise, and he gets promoted to squad leader. Carmen breaks up with him by sending a literal Dear John letter. That's a bit of post you get when your gal back home decides to move on to greener pastures, and poor Dizzy remains love-struck and unfulfilled. Just sort of on that note, there is an absolutely cracked scene earlier where Dizzy gets knocked out by Zim, and Rico is just tickled pink by the whole thing. Just incredible. Things are all sort of jumbled together in my synopsis here, but also during this we get the where around the world is Carmen Ibanez. She's in space, being a hotshot pilot with a weirdo fucking hot guy who somehow already outranks her, even though they were in high school 10 minutes ago. I hate almost all these scenes, and the only time I've ever remembered how much of them are in the movie is while taking notes for this script. Literally, I've had to go back and update what I've been writing several times now because I keep forgetting about this B-plot, which is completely original to the film and adds so little to it. Most frustrating, though, is that it's unironically kind of sexist in how it's constructed, with Xander getting the most ridiculous white boy promotion I've ever seen so that he's in an unnecessarily asymmetrical power dynamic with Carmen. Mostly I chalk it up to bad writing via V. Newmeyer and the sheer difficulties of trying to flesh out a character that doesn't need to be fleshed out and didn't exist at all in the source material. Carmen is barely in the book, and for good reason. She's smarter, a harder worker, and more career-driven than Rico by a country mile. Book Carmen doesn't get 97s in math, she gets other students 97s in math because she tutors them while getting all-around perfect grades. When she goes to recruiting, it's an instant pass go for her, while Johnny finds out, slowly but surely, that he's essentially an idiot with no hope for anything more mentally demanding than an infantry billet, which is about the dumbest job you can get in the military, except motor transport. But honestly, Carmen gets done dirty in this movie. Xander is absolutely worst boy in a movie with basically nothing but worst boys, and she has to learn from him while he's fondling the sexual harassment panda off screen. Also, they changed the hyperspeed space magic that lets you go between solar systems from Cherenkov Drive to Star Drive, which just sounds like a god-awful Jay Leno podcast. The first act ends with Rico futzing the stupidest training exercise I've ever seen. Though it does have some parallel in the book, one of his recruit buddies, Breckenridge, played by Eric Bruce-Cotter, takes his helmet off during this American Gladiator live fire rifle range exercise, and another recruit stumbles and blows the dude's head off. I can't really show this on YouTube, but it's probably one of my top 10 practical effects shots of all time. Shout out Sean Smith of Jaeger Productions, with Tom Flutes on construction and Dave Miner on puppeteering. Absolutely tremendous work. Johnny takes a spiritual hit from this event and decides to drop out of boot camp after taking an administrative lashing. This is a nod to an actual scene from the book, executed differently and for different reasons, but it is a part of Johnny nearly washing out of the mobile infantry. He's given a little weird rubber band mouthpiece thing, and then he gets his stripes. The guy behind him is using a real whip, by the way, and he learned how to use it on set. I love that the quote about this in Salmon's behind-the-scenes book can literally give you whiplash. A real whip is a very dangerous, lethal weapon, said stunt coordinator Vic Armstrong in Salmon. Yet for this scene, we couldn't really use a stunt double for Casper because the shot was so laid out as to be looking over Casper's shoulder and seemed like that whip was really hitting him in the back. So the first thing I did was teach the actor playing Corporal Bronsky, Teo, the enlisted man who actually flogs Johnny how to handle a real bullwhip. And that's a little skill I picked up doubling for Harrison Ford in the Indiana Jones pictures. Johnny resigns, and just as he's walking out of Camp Arthur Curry, which is the name of his boot camp in both the book and its adaptation, FedNet clicks on and we find out his family died in that ominous phone call he had a second ago. Johnny gets rightfully upset about this and asks ASAC Hank Schrader to do a takesies-backsies on his resignation. That gives Zim a chance to rip up the resignation form, get demoted to private, and eventually show up again at the end of the story. This last scene is basically a series of different boot camp scenes all mushed together, really to the overall deficit of the film. We will literally never know what could have been, and more than a few of the missing pieces of the puzzle to Heinlein's ideology are lost there, but in the meantime, would you like to know more? Yes, it's another FedNet scene, this time talking about war in all caps as we steadily reapproach the first scenes in the movie. We see the Buenos Aires of the future smushed, squashed, and splattered like a bug itself, and some fella telling us the only good bug's a dead bug. Fun fact, that fella's John Davison, the producer who pushed to get this goofy-ass movie made. In fact, and I sort of hinted at this before, nearly everybody in these FedNet scenes are typically behind the camera folks doing cameos well after filming had wrapped. Salmon writes in Behind the Scenes that the largesse of the FedNet scenes were filmed roughly in 1 week late in January 1997. This period, colloquially referred to as FedNet Week, occurred deep into post-production, well after principal and second unit photography had wrapped in October. But you may ask, how does Paul know? Well, my dude was there and you already seen him. He's one of the two guys ushering in the sacrificial cow during the everyone knows arachnids are dangerous scene. Hi, Paul. Literally, if you are still watching at this point, you are now morally obligated to tell Paul M. Salmon hello in the comments. All that bit of fun aside, the astute amongst you might be asking themselves, if Starship Troopers was a satire, then why would the most inarguably satirical scenes all have been thrown together in about a week, nearly 3 months after all the main photography was done and a massive amount of even the post-production was finished? Well, what possible conclusion might I be leading you to? Would you like to know less? We get more FedNet scenes anyway, like I said, including one of the most talked about in online circles, where Doogie Howser pulls a strap and does some impromptu dissections of a bug. He shoots off one of its legs and says it's still 86% combat effective, which is just literally a reduction of 1/8 because it has 8 legs. I really just love this movie. He then says to shoot it in the brainstem to put it down, which, fair. I get why people think this is such a goofy scene, and it is ginned up some, but I got enemy threat classes like this in the military. I got a lot of classes like this in the military. You gotta understand, the instructions on the bag for you to feed yourself have immortalized the phrase, a rock or something, in generations of grunts. The ideas behind this scene are present to a degree in the book, but first, cockroaches. In a really weird scene that I don't appreciate very much, where a lady is gleefully clapping as kids smash a bunch of, I believe, real cockroaches. I can't remember seeing anything about this in Salmon, but that's a weird scene to film because it's not satirical. Like, Verhoeven is the one organizing a cockroach holocaust and getting the lady to clap gleefully, which only further solidifies the idea that in even the most satirical sections of his adaptation, Verhoeven is taking the extra steps to pander to the fascist mindset without any clear indication to the contrary. Either way, the second act begins with a clean FedNet transition back to a live broadcast aboard a UCF dropship, getting ready for the, we know, soon-to-be doomed invasion of Clendathu. Rico, Flores, and company are listening to music and drinking and getting tattoos, high on life and ready to fight. It's interesting to note this scene is the movie's, I believe, only mention of the term cap trooper. In the books, all mobile infantry are cap troopers. The cap there is short for capsule, which in this case is a multi-stage landing device shot from ships in planetary orbit that disintegrates on the way down to the surface, delivering the mobile infantryman to combat operation zones. The entire capsule premise was completely dropped from the Verhoeven adaptation, but I just wanted to note that. Back aboard ship, we have what I can only describe as a corny 1950s style sock hop type of party in a ship common area. Scenes like this were everywhere in 80s movies. Top Gun and Back to the Future immediately come to mind, with some working class greaser crew getting into a scuffle with the clean-cut preps. I'm mainly bringing this up for two reasons. The first is, I don't know if this was intentional as part of the tonal goofiness of the movie, or if Ed Neumeyer just had a psychic connection to those teeny bopper 50s nostalgia movies. A great deal of his romantic subplot seems reliant on those tropes. The second is Xander gets punched. Not enough, and the love triangle subplot pushes onward, and then we are down on the surface of Klendathu. It's an ugly planet. A bug planet. It's actually Casper, Wyoming. Or rather, it's a place called Hell's Half Acre near Casper, Wyoming, which served as the filming location for the Klendathu scenes. And the place certainly looks like a hellish bug planet, ginned up somewhat with computer effects to really sell the alienness of it. On Klendathu, we really come face to face with how useless the mobile infantry's training has been. Helldivers 2 returns to this conceptually as well. It has a notoriously short and unencompassing tutorial that barely teaches you thing one about how to fight the hordes of enemies in that universe. You also see that probably not a lot of Rico's squad mates got to watch that Doogie Howser killshot video, as MI troopers dump mag after mag into just one or two bugs with little to no effect. Let's talk about the bugs. As I mentioned at the start of this thing, the bugs are the true stars of Starship Troopers. Before any of the human talent was brought on board, hell, before even most of Starship Troopers funding was okayed, the main focus was on the bugs. The final look of the bugs was a collaborative effort between Neumeyer, Davison, and Tippett, but Verhoeven made a lot of the most notable changes to the creatures and Craig Hayes drew them. The original plan had been to keep them close to their depiction in the Heinlein novel, but Verhoeven decided against that early in the process. He told me, "No, I'm not ready for this. I can't see a bug holding a gun," Hayes said in an interview with Salmon. Verhoeven's chief concern was logistical at this stage. How could you get a bug to hold a gun, fly a spaceship, and also look threatening and realistic on screen? The answer was, nix that, let's do something else. They dumbed down the bugs, took away the tool use aspect of the design, and made them into one of my favorite movie monsters of all time. Also, they invariably separated the creatures from any possible connection to the deeper themes of Heinlein's novel, but that's a discussion better saved for later in this video. Under Tippett's supervision, Hayes drew up a ton of bugs. Drama and believability, Hayes said in an interview with Salmon. Those were the two rules all the bug designs had to satisfy. And one of my original inspirations was my wife's catatonic fear of insects, Neumeyer said in the LA Times article from 1996. They're like insects, says sharks. All they do is come up to you and kill you. They have a ground speed of 35 miles an hour. Their mode of attack is overwhelming force. My science teacher in 7th grade said, the Chinese, they'll march at you like zombies with wooden sticks in their hands, and even if you had a machine gun in your hand, they'd overwhelm you. That's what I think about the bugs. Okay. Okay, that last part is a touch spicy. I'm not even going to make the excuse for him that it was 1996, but why was that something his 7th grade science teacher said to him? Just absolutely out of pocket. I'm bringing this all up not just because that's an absolute banger of a quote and I love the bugs, but also because one of the most phenomenally baffling points I've seen brought up about the bugs is that they're somehow secretly the good guys, or that you're supposed to be rooting against the humans and for them, or any series of variations of those ideas. If you feel a sense of sympathy for the bugs, I can't take that away from you, but understand you're seeing something that isn't there. And of almost all the points brought up in certain online circles about this movie, these have been the most reaching and the most bizarre. Verhoeven himself says the bugs of his film are monstrous and lacking in any human emotion. But that's how we humans always see our enemy. Verhoeven says in an interview with Salmon, "Demonization is the norm. When we fight a Saddam Hussein, he's immediately the devil and the incarnation of evil. All of his citizens are devils too. That's why the insects are not humanized in this picture. Because in no enemy that you fight a life and death battle against will you be able to see anything human anymore." This concept isn't merely expressed in the animation and design of the bugs, but even in the musical score, the very soul of the film, the bugs are not represented. There is no leitmotif for them, merely the silence before the storm, and then the crunch and rattle and crack of their bodies moving en masse toward our protagonists. When you hear music then, it's human terror that is singing to you. One thing we haven't done, however, is create the full-blooded theme for the most obvious characters in the film, the bugs, said composer Basil Polidorus, who scored the film, in an interview with Salmon. "In fact, the way I'm scoring those scenes, the music is almost acting against the bugs. Because the sounds the bugs make have this incredibly sharp edge, they sound almost electronic, although of course they are organic creatures, so I felt it would be interesting to compose very little music for the bugs themselves. Instead, I'm primarily scoring the human reaction to the bugs. And this all plays perfectly on screen. The expository loop that begins with the first FedNet sequence comes full circle as Rico is impaled through the leg and seemingly left for dead in the dark on Clendathu. The high school hope and optimism, even the controlled violence of boot camp, all that is washed away in a torrent of blood and sand. Washed away too are the remaining non-white members of our cast so far. Shout out my boy Shujumi, also shout out Carmen's dead-ass boss, and like half the Navy who also died because they fly their spaceships around like 2 feet from each other, even though they have all of space to float around in. We sandwich Clendathu with another FedNet scene, this time talking about how the mission was a massive failure. This not scene but plot point is in the book as well. In Verhoeven's adaptation, it's an almost comical moment, and I've seen arguments that this is an aspect of the satire shining through, the gross military incompetence, that is. 100,000 troopers dead in 1 hour. That might seem ridiculous, but it's unfortunately not that extreme of an exaggeration. In the First World War, for instance, 27,000 French soldiers died in a single day on August 22nd, 1914, during the Battle of the Frontiers. At the Somme, on July 1st, 1916, 19,240 British soldiers were killed in a single day. In the Los Angeles Times interview from '96, Verhoeven himself said he modeled the bugs after A Bridge Too Far or The Battle of the Bulge, if the Germans were insects. Interestingly, the UCF response to being routed is anti-reactionary, as opposed to their earlier stratagem of total annihilation. The next FedNet segment shows Sky Marshal Deans being replaced by Sky Marshal Tahat Maru, who says, "In order to defeat the bug, we must understand the bug." We then move to another segment in which Paul Verhoeven predicts the existence of Ben Shapiro nearly 20 years early, and we get one of my favorite lines in the movie. "Frankly, I find the idea of a bug that thinks offensive." That actor there is Timothy McNeil, who is merely credited on IMDb as expert, and he's not in a lot else, but goddamn is he perfect in that role. Give that dude a chat and some donos and he'd be running Kick in a fucking week. Either way, that's our last FedNet scene until the end of the movie. From here, we enter basically Act 2.2. We've lost all our supporting cast from the first half of the movie on Clendathu, but we are gunning up to get shit done. Johnny Rico is fine, because he has to be, floating in a back-to-tank as his leg is stitched back together by space lasers. Jake Busey is here with all his Jake Busey teeth all just hanging out, and Dizzy Flores leaves Johnny a little unasked for and unrequited kiss. We find out that Johnny's teacher from Exposition High is the leader of the unit that dragged him off Clendathu before the bugs finished the job, Lieutenant Gene Radshak's Roughnecks, which Rico Flores, and Jake Busey all immediately join just ahead of a mission to Tango Urilla in the Clandathu system. They go there, and the main cast survives, generally unscathed. Rico rides a gigantic scarab beetle that spits fire acid, and he gets a promotion for doing cool rodeo jumps and flips, and then finally bangs Flores at the beer and violin party. Very cool. They play that maybe racist, maybe not folk song Dixie, which I'll just say I wanted to put something in here addressing its presence in the movie, but that rabbit hole is too deep, dark, and dangerous to tread down, and this video is already long enough. So I'll just say you can interpret them playing Dixie literally however you want, and you might be right. I didn't find much on that in Salmon's book, so if you find some tidbits, let me know. Also, if you're like me, at this point in the film, or even recalling it at some point in the future, you may be trying to count on your fingers how many planets they actually go to. Because all of the goddamn planets are just bits of badland out in the American Midwest, South Dakota and Wyoming specifically. It wasn't until I was writing this and got confused that I had to stop and write down the list of planets. Here you go. Clandathu, for 2 different sequences that both happen at the same time. Dantana, shown in a FedNet segment, but never visited. It looks just like Planet P, where the Roughnecks respond to a distress call after the successful eradication mission on Tango Urilla. Dantana looks just like Planet P because they are the same place in real life, and they just used a picture of the major set piece for Planet P, Whiskey Outpost, as a stand-in for the Mormon extremist colony. They then go back to P after the Whiskey Outpost scene toward the end of the movie, and we'll get to that, but those are all the planets. And all of those places are in America. You could visit right now if you wanted to. Anyway, we go to P and do a little jaunt through the rocks there. During the patrol to Whiskey Outpost, which is sending out distress beacons for pickup, one of the Roughnecks is snatched by a flying bug that starts stabbing him to death in the ass with a maybe 3-foot-long stinger. Ratchak takes a scoped rifle from one of the men and puts the poor bastard out of his misery. Now, I've heard some talk that this scene is ridiculous or over the top, but bro, if I'm getting sloppy toppy from an alien wasp literally 4 times the size of a Vespa scooter, hook me up with that lead anesthetic. Ratchak follows this up, saying he'd expect any of the other Roughnecks to do the same for him, which, spoiler. I'll just add that none of this essentially is in the book. Whiskey Outpost, the big set-piece fight, Ratchak's extreme fatalism, Jake Busey's teeth, none of it. In fact, the entire Ratchak scene countermands a lot of what does happen in the book, but we'll get to that. First, we gotta get to the end of Act 2. We arrive at Whiskey Outpost, and it's a fucking mess. Everybody's dead, awesome, save one shell-shocked idiot who's been pulling the old Otacon hiding in a freezer with his pee pants on. He informs the Roughnecks that some crazy shit has been going on, and we see the first hints of that bug that thinks. An outpost trooper's gotten his brain sucked out, and the bugs made him do a zombie distress call, and now every goddamn bug on the planet is coming to Whiskey Outpost, which they should have known was going to happen because the bugs have quite clearly been coming up through the ground in this place for a while. The coolest set-piece fight in the movie happens, and major characters get shaken loose from the branch like so many whispering leaves on a fall evening. Well, they die screaming while being stabbed, burned, eaten, torn to pieces, and what have you, and eventually Carmen and Captain Douchebag float down from heaven to provide evac. Flores dies in Rico's arms and says her entire life was validated by getting to have sex with him just once. Now, my wife was drinking on the couch next to me watching this movie for the first time in her life as I took notes, and at this point she literally said, "What the fuck was that?" Dizzy was the only character she and sort of everybody else likes in this movie. Dizzy dies ignominiously, as most characters do in the book as well, but it especially sucks here because she's kind of the only emotional connection you might have to the film at this point. Unless you're particularly invested in Van Dien's chin or Busey's teeth. Busey survives to the end, by the way. I'm just going to piss down your leg with that bit of information before we continue on. Dizzy gets buried in space. by which I mean they just sort of eject her out the side of the ship. To quote my wife at this point, does her coffin just float around space forever? Yeah, I guess. Unless it gets pulled into P's tidal pull and burns up in the atmosphere. Doogie Howser, SS, shows up at this point and he's wearing Gestapo clothes, which I guess is supposed to be satirical of something, but I don't know what. They sort of work in the situation. Like, I don't know what to tell you. Neil Patrick Harris kind of rocks that fit. But also, the clothes don't really make the Nazis so much as all the Nazism. Old Doogs seems like a war-weary, competent officer orchestrating a large-scale operation here, and that's what he is. The Gestapo outfit, and that basically is what it is, confirmed by Harris himself, doesn't have any actual Nazi stuff on it. Compare with Pink's satirical Nazi costuming in Pink Floyd's The Wall, where there's literally no doubt whatsoever what's being portrayed, and where even if you don't understand the source material, the negativity of Pink's presence and the overall badness of the scene reads 100%. Doogie Howser SS is only on screen for a brief bit of time to expostulate the motivation for the upcoming scenes and then dip. He doesn't sell any sort of overtly negative character features that can't just as easily be explained by the fact that he's in the military during an extremely stressful time period. This is, mind you, a character that's also had only a handful of minutes of screen time at this point in the movie, and his last appearance was in a commercial. To reiterate, this is just moments after a massive set-piece fight where we lost nearly all of our new characters, saw a bunch of cool fights even before that, and we just sent Best Girl off into orbit. The average moviegoer, especially in the 1990s, generally missed and or didn't care about these microscopic details that are superfluous to the actual core of the film, which is not satire. Verhoeven's Starship Troopers has a runtime of approximately 2 hours and 9 minutes, of which the FedNet scenes, where essentially all of the overtly satirical moments take place, comprise a total of 6 minutes and 13 seconds. If we round that up to an extremely generous 9 minutes, that leaves us with 2 hours of a film that is non-stop action with a clear-cut message of us versus them. The good guys versus the bugs, done in the style of the most influential propagandist of the literal Nazi regime, where people, beautiful, young, exemplar specimens of the human race are pitted against mindless, heartless, relentless killing machines. All of this to soaring, patriotic trumpets in a world where everybody is healthy, strong, and has a purpose, where the government admits its mistakes and changes its course to better accomplish its mission. Starship Troopers is propaganda, not a satire of propaganda. Not even really satire, it is propaganda. In every single conceivable way that propaganda works, this movie works to that end. But you might say, the fascists don't know they're being made fun of. Aren't we so much more clever than them? They don't care. Let me put it this way. You know that adorable little pseudo-anecdote lefties like to tell each other about the Nazi showing up at the punk bar and the bartender tells him to piss off because if you let just one in, you'll Nazi the place up and then you can't get them out? If you already have an established place and a single Nazi can kick off a full-blown infestation, then what do you think building a Nazi habitat, specially attuned to the collective needs of Nazis, is going to do? Probably going to attract some fucking Nazis who will feel right at home. And your cute little mirror you hang up in the corner with the words, "Look how ridiculous you all are," isn't going to do a whole lot to dissuade them from enjoying themselves. But Tyler, you say, having read none of the source material nor done any research into the project aside from huffing a few paper bags full of your own self-aggrandizing farts, Tyler, Paul Verhoeven said the movie is a satire, and satirizing fascists, satirizing Nazis is good. This I know, because my streamers tell me so. Well, my point really is, do you want this society? Verhoeven says in an interview with Salmon. In fact, there's a recurring line in Ed's script which appears during most every FedNet scene. That is, would you like to know more? For Neumeyer and myself, that meant, do you want to know more about this futuristic society? Or in another way, what we're asking the audience is, do you like this society? Verhoeven continues along this track, saying the FedNet scenes are counterpoint to the main narrative, which is, as I believe I've fairly succinctly laid out at this point, that fascism kind of fucking slaps. Like any system, it has its ups and downs, but I was alive in the 1990s, and I can tell you as a child at the time, the world of the Verhoeven adaptation looked infinitely better in every way. Even as an adult, the UCF is, by every metric, better than current-day America. Verhoeven, likely realizing that even a distillation of Heinlein's utopic stratocracy would be extremely appealing, basically added some tongue-in-cheek infomercials to deflate the inherently pro-fascist message of the film. The FedNet scenes are a counterpoint, Verhoeven says. Still, by seeing and hearing the bot scenes in the FedNet and the ones involving the main characters, you get a more dimensional vision of the society they live in. If we had only presented Heinlein's story straight, I think you would have seen much less of that, just as you could also ask yourself, after receiving the perspective of this whole culture, would a society that has to fight another race, in this case a non-human one, need a dictatorial or crypto-dictatorial management in order to win? The resounding message of the movie, given how it ends, is yes, because the counterpoint to that message is insufficient, and by the very nature of its creation, laughable. There is only one way forward, it barely sort of works, but it is working at the end with just a few slight adjustments, as we see when we go back to P to finish up the third act climax of Verhoeven's adaptation. Doogie Howser SS sends the Roughnecks, now under the command of Johnny Rico after a field promotion from the Dukester, back to P to capture the brain bug that revealed itself with the false SOS at Whiskey Outpost. The mission goes well, and then it doesn't, with Carmen's capital ship getting blown out of the air by heavy fire from the surface. Carmen and Xander evac, and for some reason their escape pod doesn't stay in space with the other ships, but instead immediately goes and crash lands on P, barreling down into the hive of tunnels beneath the surface. Rico, meanwhile, is leading an assault on the planet, trying to carry out the mission, and hears the SOS from Carmen's ship. He decides to continue on with the mission because, you know as well as I do, she's already dead. That mentality lasts for like 2 more scene transitions, and then his pussy sense starts tingling and he decides to go save Carmen. Here we get one of the best scenes in the movie and one of the most notorious. Xander and Carmen get incapacitated by warrior bugs and brought before the brain bug, a vagina-faced ultra-tick monstrosity that can drink your thoughts like a milkshake. Xander tells the thing, "Someday someone like me is gonna kill you and your whole fucking race." Then he spits on the brain bug and gets milkshaked. During this scene, my wife said, "Good, that's what you get for spitting on people." Carmen cuts the brain bug's talon off. There's a little standoff when Johnny comes to rescue her, and then they do basically the last action scene, and the last non-white member of the cast sacrifices himself with a mini nuke. The operation ends as our protagonists try to get out of the labyrinth of tunnels, and we find out that Zim caught the brain bug. Doogie Howser, SS, does his "It's Afraid" line, which for some reason is now a massive right-wing meme, and the characters share their final on-screen moment together. We find out that Rico's pussy sense wasn't tingling, it was just the Dukester sending him psychic waves to find Carmen. Very cool. We then hit the last sequence of FedNet commercials in the outro, with the brain bug being tortured for its wondrous juices, and we end on literally a recruitment commercial urging you to join. Service guarantees citizenship, and without irony, the movie ends on an extremely positive note. They'll keep fighting and they'll win. Roll fucking credits. Actually, don't. I need to add the last bit of my notes here regarding the film's internals. I've seen plenty of people argue online that you should gravitate toward the brain bug or that it's misunderstood or something similar, which ultimately fails too, because to quote Verhoeven, that bug is an evil god. He is an evil god, really, Verhoeven says in an interview with Salmon. In fact, I always felt the brain bug was like a monster out of an H.P. Lovecraft story, almost like his famous Chulu, with its multiple eyes and whatnot. He continues, I read a lot of Lovecraft when I was in my 20s, and when I was getting the look of the brain bug from Tippett and shooting its scenes with the full-scale ADI brain bug, I really felt closely connected to Lovecraft. The brain bug was like an evil Lovecraftian god to me, one of the old ones. One that was coming out of the darkness of the bug tunnels, coming out of the earth, in fact, which is a favorite Lovecraftian motive. So, if you think the bugs are meant to be seen as sympathetic, well, get dunked on, buddy. Part 2.3. The Reception. Starship Troopers released November 7th, 1997 to mixed to bad reviews and very little in the way of overall cultural penetration. Earnings started well and rapidly declined through the winter season, garnering a total of $121 million against a budget of around $100 million. Speaking from the experience of being in the 90s and absolutely obsessed with this property as a kid, I can tell you there was nobody interested in it but me. The few Starship Troopers toys you might see out at the store vanished completely in the post-Christmas season, and with the exception of some returns to the property here and there in the form of cartoons and exceptionally terrible straight-to-DVD sequels, for over a decade after this movie came out, I thought I was the only one who knew about it. I didn't really have free access to the internet until the mid-2000s, and then I was in the Marines and then Iraq, and it wasn't until I started seeing Cracked.com articles that I even knew anybody else had more than a passing interest in this film or its subsequent properties. I myself mainly got interested in the film because of a tie-in comic simply called Starship Troopers that only came as the first of 2 issues, with the entire first comic basically completing a high-speed version of the Klendathu loop from the first half of the movie. I can't tell you specifically when I first watched the film, only that I know it was pre-2000s because I wasn't in high school yet, and unfortunately, VHS tapes don't come with a watch history. In the greater United States, Verhoeven's adaptation was met with general ambivalence and a healthy dollop of eye-rolling exasperation for both the Dutch director's latest creation and the man himself. Over-the-top action franchises were a dime a dozen at the time. In fact, one of the most absurd movies of all time, Air Force One, starring Harrison Ford, had run Starship Troopers trailers during its release earlier that year. That's the movie where Harrison Ford, the President of the United States of America, literally kicks a terrorist kidnapper out the door of Air Force One. The phrase, "Get off my plane," was the closest thing we had to a meme for the rest of that year. Well, that and, "I did not have sexual relations with that woman." TriStar Pictures had actually pushed the launch of Starship Troopers back to accommodate Air Force One's July release, and that of the much more successful Will Smith film Men in Black, another sci-fi entry that really needs no introduction. Audiences generally didn't get Starship Troopers or its deeper message when it came out. Even Neumeier himself said in an interview with Sci-Fi Bulletin around 2017, "Thank God for the UK because you guys got it. When it came out in the United States, people were like, hey, what is this thing? But you guys got it immediately, and I appreciate that. I spent time as a teenager in England and watched a lot of weird things on the BBC. You guys get satire and black humor. It was great to see the reviews and reactions." If you're a youngin' and confused why a message that's obvious to you isn't readily apparent to everyone else, you have to understand the average moviegoer in 1997 was being absolutely inundated with psychotic action movie premises. There were new Schwarzenegger movies nearly every year in the 90s that included films like True Lies, where in the climax he chases a dude on a dirt bike through a hotel on horseback and eventually jumps out a window onto a Harrier jet. We had The Rock a year before, where Nicolas Cage and Sean Connery break into Alcatraz prison to stop a face-melting ultra virus from being used in a terror plot carried out by former Marine Special Forces. In 1997, we have Con Air, starring Nick Cage again as a convict being flown home to be released at the end of his sentence. John Malkovich takes over the plane to orchestrate an escape with his gang, and we get introduced to Steve Buscemi as a Hannibal Lecter-type serial killer who just sort of wanders into a casino at the end of that movie, and it's treated like a sort of heroic moment for some reason. I say all this to essentially clinch the final points I have to make about this movie, and it's that it failed as a satire in essentially every way. It is, without reservation, much better fascist propaganda than it is satire, enough so that even the critics of the time had trouble discerning whether it was intentional propaganda or just so badly done it served as propaganda anyway. To quote Rita Kempley in her 1997 write-up of the film for the Washington Post, Verhoeven draws parallels with vintage World War II movies, right down to a reenactment of D-Day landings at Normandy, but he seems more drawn to Nazi chic than Yankee gumption. The higher-ranking officers, including Neil Patrick Harris of TV's Doogie Howser MD, are got up as stormtroopers. I feel that I've made my point enough here, which is Starship Troopers is holistically not a satire at all. It just contains a handful of afterthought satirical underpinnings that don't in any meaningful way change the core message of the movie. That message, the fascist government of the United Citizens Federation is a clean, generally crime-free near paradise with space-age medicine, literal spaceships, and a broad swath of possible career paths for its youth that boasts an all-volunteer army. That sounds fucking awesome. And if you don't agree, you're literally not to be trusted as a human being. The closest you can get to an argument is vibes-based, and honey, you can't eat vibes. And vibes don't keep you from getting ripped limb from limb by a gigantic spider monster. The best possible argument I can make against the Verhoeven adaptation's UCF is that only citizens get the franchise, which, I'll tell you, a lot of Americans wouldn't care that much about in practice if they could get all of the above in trade. I mean, literally, the online lefties whose opinions informed the need for me to make this video are now split down the middle over whether they should not vote in a major upcoming election for the most profoundly infantile reasons I've ever heard articulated. I won't harp on this any further than to say, if you are the sort of person who made tweets or God fucking forbid whole videos talking about how dumb people are for not getting that Starship Troopers was fascist, you should take those down. Quietly, quickly, and if you're a fan of those people, send them this video. I'm fairly comprehensive, I believe, in my arguments, but if you'd like to debate this, I'm around. Come find me in one of my many holes. I await thee. All that said, though, what happened, Paul? How did Verhoeven mess things up this bad? To the point he's accidentally making fascist propaganda while attempting satire. Well, primarily, it's just the nature of capitalism. Throughout Salmon's behind the scenes of Starship Troopers, we see just how difficult the process of even getting this movie made was, and I have to hand one thing above all to Verhoeven. The man is a goddamn professional. He turned $100 million into costumes and effects and jobs and transportation and generally created a democratic workplace where everybody came together to make the best movie possible. To that end, he put the satirical elements, the least important ingredient, aside until after everything else was done, until every last thread was in place, and then he indulged himself. That's it. Everybody who worked under him liked him by all accounts, and the studio was extremely happy with how the adaptation turned out. It was one of TriStar Pictures' largest openings, and really the biggest thing that got in the way of its success was ineffective marketing. Just to hammer this home, readers at TriStar Pictures, those are people who literally read optioned material to see if it'll make a good film, had suggested the high potential cost of adapting Starship Troopers and the lackluster overall plot would make a successful film of the property nearly impossible. But Verhoeven pulled it off. So what's the issue? Well, Verhoeven led himself astray by falling into a self-made trap. He attempted to satirize fascism as a concept, but did so under the auspices of filming an adaptation of Heinlein's Starship Troopers. But here's the thing, Heinlein's novel does not directly advocate fascism, and Heinlein himself is not fascist by any credible definition. I submit that the absolute failure of Starship Troopers as a self-declared counter-fascist satire can be best explained by this quote from a 2017 DigitalSpy.com interview conducted by Leigh Singer, titled, "Starship Troopers 20 Years On. Director Paul Verhoeven reveals how his movie predicted Donald Trump." Leaving aside the oddly long title and its somewhat self-defeating conjecture, the quote in question reads as follows. "Ed and I disagreed with Robert Heinlein, and we felt that we needed to counter with our own narrative," Verhoeven explains. "Basically, the political undercurrent of the film is that these heroes and heroines are living in a fascist utopia. But they are not even aware of it. They think this is normal. And somehow you are seduced to follow them. And at the same time made aware that they might be fascists." But you are hopefully asking, how does one counter a utopian narrative? The answer is, flatly, you can't. So long as the utopia endures, such is the literal nature of utopia. And further, when that narrative is amplified without being countered, what are we left with but highly stylized, highly effective propaganda, which is quite the incredible failure because, and I cannot state this flatly enough, Heinlein's novel is not predicated on the belief that fascism is good and it is a social necessity to implement fascism. But that's something you can only learn about Starship Troopers if you read the book. Would you like to know more? Part 2.4. Robert Anson Heinlein. "Come on, you apes. You want to live forever?" Unknown Platoon Sergeant, 1918. Robert Anson Heinlein was born 7 July 1907 in Butler, Missouri, and died in his sleep on the morning of May 8, 1988, before the adaptation of his work by the Verhoeven team, before the social and economic upheaval of the early mid-2000s, and before the internet handed all the Earth's knowledge back to its people. According to William H. Patterson Jr.'s biography of him, the young Heinlein developed a voracious appetite for science fiction after witnessing the 1910 perihelion appearance of Halley's Comet. The comet would return once more in Heinlein's lifetime, in 1986, shortly before his death. The brightest comet appearance until, coincidentally, April 1st, 1997, when the Hale-Bopp comet passed in perihelion just a few months before the opening day of Starship Troopers. That doesn't have anything to do with anything. Space is just cool. Heinlein enrolled in the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland in June 1925, and was commissioned to ensign after graduating in 1929. He served with honor on the USS Lexington, CV-2, also called the Lady Lex and later the USS Roper, a Wicks-class destroyer that had only recently been recommissioned after being out of service for about 8 years. The Roper, a smaller class of ship than aircraft carriers like the Lexington, was considerably more prone to jostling, which caused Heinlein to contract seasickness and then pulmonary tuberculosis, which ended his military career in 1934. Rated totally and permanently disabled, he found himself washed out of his first choice of career. This all might seem like minor trivia, but it is absolutely crucial to understanding the heart of Starship Troopers, so keep that in mind. Patterson's biography of Heinlein states the man then tried his hand at a second career in politics, in Hollywood of all places, and that failed campaign dashed his political aspirations. After that, he started writing. For time, I'm going to cut out the middle years from 1939 to 1959, but understand that in that time, the Second World War broke out and Heinlein was denied a second attempt at serving his country, much to his chagrin. Still, he managed to assist the war effort through taking up a civil engineering job and doing his part until the close of the war. Afterward, he started writing juveniles, or stories for boys. He saw a great deal of success, some mild acclaim, he won a Hugo, and then in 1958, he dropped basically everything after seeing a single advertisement in the local newspaper. The piece in question was a full-page petition by the National Committee for a Sane Nuclear Policy, signed, by Heinlein's own words in his rebuttal piece, who are the heirs of Patrick Henry, 70-odd local people and 60-odd national names. To keep it short, Heinlein argues and airs that nuclear disarmament by the United States in that far-gone day of April 18, 1958, was the idea of poltroons and pacifists who had succumbed to Soviet communist propaganda. Essentially, that while it sounded nice to, not risk blowing up the world, trusting the Kremlin for any reason was foolish, and the US would be handing them the world on a platter if we reduced or terminated our nuclear arsenal. In his words, "Those who signed that manifesto have made their choice. Consciously or unconsciously, they prefer enslavement to death. Such is their right, and we do not argue with them. We speak to you." He literally wrote that in bold. "We speak to you, who are still free in your souls." To say Heinlein was furiously passionate about his side of the argument and not in the least a touch terrified that the US would be undermined by soft-headed and warm-hearted Americans who were easily swayed by Soviet propaganda is an understatement. He even named the piece after Patrick Henry, the American founding father who coined the phrase that should actually be on all our money: "Give me liberty or give me death." After the publication of The Heirs of Patrick Henry, Heinlein got to work on what would become his best-known and most controversial work of fiction, and without irony, an inspirational forefather to more works than I could ever track down. Orbital drop shock troopers, power armor, boot camp in space, ship-to-planet combat, FTL warships, even the vibes of what goes on in the downtime on ship while you're doing some space magic warp from solar system to solar system. It's dubiously also the oldest mention I've heard. That does not mean it is the oldest mention of glassing planets as a military necessity or cracking planets with novel futuristic weapons, and for sure, in preceding Frank Herbert's Dune, it's the oldest, almost completely political science fiction book I've ever read. Just to show how ahead of his time Heinlein was, remember when I said he did some engineering work in World War II because he couldn't serve in any official capacity in the military? Well, during the last weeks of the war, Heinlein, being something of a space fanatic, wrote 2 letters formally urging the Navy to take up space exploration, according to the Patterson biography. Specifically, Heinlein urged them to put into practice the launching of space rockets from seagoing vessels. One of the letters never made it out of his lab, but the other went all the way to President Truman's cabinet before it got killed. Space travel would eventually become the domain of the United States Air Force, but that said, by 6th March 1953, the Gato-class submarine, the USS Tunney, had been refitted to carry and fire the Regulus I nuclear cruise missile. And I'm just saying, the earliest conceptual use of the term miniature nuke I've ever heard also comes from this book. A full understanding of Starship Troopers' impact alone would serve as its own video and require a depth of research far more expansive than my literal lifetime has room for. But understand that without reservation, your favorite modern sci-fi author has been inspired by the mimetic legacy of Starship Troopers, whether they know it or not, because it was just that goddamn big. And in a lot of cases, the inspirations may have come from authors existing in different tones and intensities of disagreement with Heinlein, largely over the political and pessimistic utopianism, for lack of a better phrase, of his work. You see, Starship Troopers is not an action story, nor really is it a war story or any kind of story, which is what makes it unique. There are narrative elements in the book, but it follows no typical conventions casual readers might be familiar with. Instead, it's presented quite similarly to a military journal. The sort written by tired old officers and non-coms reaching the ends of long careers who wish to impart their mistakes and glories onto the coming generations to better change their maybe fortunes. Without reservation, the sort of manuals, journals, logs, and dissertations a young Heinlein would have been assigned as required reading at the Naval Academy. So why, after penning this vitriolic, red-blooded denial of authoritarian, communistic tyranny, did Robert Heinlein write a book extolling the virtues of fascism? Why did he write a book that depicts an almost all-white future, with restrictive breeding programs where children are fed relentlessly to the ever-opened maw of war and criminals are executed before gleeful crowds and mass televised public hangings? The fact of the matter is, he didn't. Would you like to know more? I always get the shakes before a drop. I've had the injections, of course, and hypnotic preparation, and it stands to reason that I can't really be afraid. The ship's psychiatrist has checked my brainwaves and asked me silly questions while I was asleep, and he tells me that it isn't fear. It isn't anything important. It's just like the trembling of an eager racehorse in the starting gate. The Heinlein novel starts with the same dedication as this video, proceeding into, in my opinion, the second most action-packed part of the story. That of a routine mission skirmishing on a hostile planet with Ratchak's roughnecks. This first section of Starship Troopers does an excellent job of establishing all the elements necessary for Heinlein's philosophical modus that forms the heart of this novel. The average modern reader, at least at the time of this writing, might recognize here an especially common trope in modern narrative construction, that of plucking an exciting scene ex medio and dropping it forefront in order to spike the reader's interest. While this scene certainly achieves that end, and is for the same reason repeated in Verhoeven's adaptation, in the case of the novel it provides also the first of Heinlein's two new ideals. That's my term, but we'll return to it a lot. In this scene, and with stunning efficiency, Heinlein shows us the near entirety of a functional, futuristic military he has dreamed up from whole cloth. The scene starts with the first quotation of this section, where Johnny Rico is getting the pre-operation jitters most any infantryman will tell you are more standard issue than skivvies and bullets. He and the other men are being issued orders by Sergeant Jalal, known to the men as Jelly, who was operating as lieutenant because their actual platoon commander, Lieutenant Ratchak, no first name given, died on a recent mission. In rapid-fire succession, we learn a great deal of things about this world. Sergeant Jelly is a Finno-Turk, a sort of futuristic ethnicity from Iskander around Proxima. Other surnames inform us of the varied lineage of this unit. Rico, Jenkins, and Migliaccio are represented, and the unit chaplain, the aforementioned Sergeant Migliaccio, provides limited faith services to Muslims, Christians, Gnostics, Jews, whoever wanted a word with him before a drop. He was there. This militaristic egalitarianism extends all the way to combat responsibilities. In the mobile infantry, everybody drops and everybody fights. We further continue to describe the equipment of this unit, its tactics, and its mission, from the most mundane aspects of individual unit inspection to hints at the greater organization of the military. We learn that spacecraft pilots are women, and women are very good pilots, biologically superior to men in that trade in every way and shown due respect for their value in that regard. Finally, dropped into Johnny's shoes, we're introduced to the very real dangers of being a capsule trooper, an infantry unit specialized in being shot out the bottom of spacecraft and directly into a war zone. I was strapped all over, belly, forehead, shins, but I shook worse than ever. It's better after you unload. Until you do, you sit there in total darkness, wrapped up like a mummy against the acceleration, barely able to breathe, and knowing that there's just nitrogen around in the capsule even if you could get your helmet open, which you can't. Knowing that the capsule is surrounded by the firing tube anyhow, and if the ship gets hit before they fire you, you haven't got a prayer. You'll just die there, unable to move, helpless. It's that endless wait in the dark that causes the shakes, thinking that they've forgotten you. The ship has been hulled and stayed in orbit, dead, and soon you'll buy it too, unable to move, choking. Or if it's a crash orbit, you'll buy it that way, if you don't roast on the way down. This scene and the following assault on an enemy planet are harrowing, and, sad to say, one of the last particularly exciting scenes for the rest of the book. Johnny and his platoon land on the planet, surviving serious anti-air battery, and begin to, basically, commit a series of what we'd consider war crimes under modern circumstances. They attack waterworks, concentrated civilian centers, and some legitimate military targets along the way, the entire contingent moving in what's called a skirmishers formation. Verhoeven's sort of ridiculous, free-for-all troop movement in his battle choreography is a stark departure from Heinlein, whose tactics are often grounded in or directly referential to real-world situations. Skirmishers here is literally done to the number, but at a scale that's almost insane by real-world reckoning. Skirmishing is traditionally done by light, mobile infantry units essentially doing stick-and-move tactics to harass and demoralize an enemy. It's an essential tactic used in warfare across the world from ancient times to now, but the targets were typically limited to whatever someone utilizing small, man-portable arms could engage with. Sniping at other infantry, trying to start fires that could creep into enemy lines, or even trying to spook cavalry horses into stampeding. Those sorts of things. Heinlein shows us sabotage on a scale unlike anything available in the modern world. Fast-moving, armored, and heavily armed infantrymen in powered suits equipped with fire bombs, projectile weapons, and even nuclear munitions. They hit the ground deep within enemy lines, which, when attacking from space, suggests merely hitting the planet in the least defended area, and then burn out their ammo hitting any soft target they can before getting picked up and eventually repeating the process after rest and refit. I'll delve into the tactics of Starship Troopers much more thoroughly as we progress through the book and actually run across the philosophies behind the mobile infantry's mission and training. But suffice to say, I'm not particularly a fan of what's on display here. In real life, and especially at the time Heinlein was writing this novel, military jurisprudence, and any sane operational strategy, would urge against these tactics. To quote the Department of the Army Field Manual 27 Tac 10, particularly in the circumstances referred to in the preceding paragraph, loss of life and damage to property incidental to attacks must not be excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage expected to be gained. Those who plan or decide upon an attack, therefore, must take all reasonable steps to ensure not only that the objectives are identified as military objectives or defended places within the meaning of the preceding paragraph, but also that these objectives may be attacked without probable losses in lives and damage to property disproportionate to the military advantage anticipated. The field manual in this case is itself referencing the Geneva Convention relative to the protection of civilian persons in time of war, 12 August 1949, and the annex to the Hague Convention number 4, 18 October 1907, embodying the regulations respecting the laws and customs of war on land. These are publications Heinlein would have doubtless had some knowledge of, if not familiarity with, given his deep relationship with military history, and especially the conflicts of the day, which informed this novel. The first chapter ends with Dizzy Flores, a boy in the original novel, being downed, and Rico and Ace, the character played completely differently by Jake Busey in the film, mounting a tense, impromptu rescue mission. Rico has to go against his immediate orders to do this and irritates Ace in the attempt, but it ultimately only succeeds because Rico goes to help. Only together are they able to lift Flores in his extremely heavy, non-operational suit and jump toward the exfil ship. They barely make it in time, getting dragged aboard the craft by Sergeant Jelly even as the pilot is screaming through her radio that they're messing up the entire exit angle. For all this effort, there is no shouting celebration of heroism, no slaps on the back, and no immediate commendation from leadership. Flores dies in evac, and the rest of the troopers go back to the ship. Thus, we've come across the first of Heinlein's two ideals. The first, a military capable of protecting the liberal values and freedoms he felt most at threat by the rapid expansion of authoritarian communism in the 1950s, extrapolated out to the grand scale of all the rest of the universe. Authoritarian communism, as we'll come to see, is represented not by the skinnies, but by the pseudo-arachnids. This is a far more dangerous species of extraterrestrial, only even hinted at by Rico in the opening chapter. I would rather fight them than the arachnids. Those bugs make me queasy. The bugs, however, are not the true antagonists of Heinlein's troopers. Though they serve well as an antagonistic force, The true enemy Heinlein sees in the narrative is one that's already been partially destroyed, but may at any time rear its head. A society no longer able or willing to staff Heinlein's idealized future military with volunteers. A society very much like the increasingly liberal America of the 1950s, but we'll get to that. Because almost the entirety of Starship Troopers is about explaining, justifying, and establishing Heinlein's second new ideal, a society of morally selfless volunteers. Part 3.2 Rico and Terran Society. Chapter 2 begins, as nearly every chapter of Starship Troopers, with some sort of little quote. In this case, it's the lyrics to Yankee Doodle Dandy, a once mocking and modified nursery rhyme sang by British and Loyalist forces to disparage the Yankee rebels in the lead up to and during the Revolutionary War. Not so much after it, as Americans took the song as a symbol of our national heritage after winning the war and still recreate it as a marker of both that era and the American spirit of revolution. Literally, there's a very famous Archibald Willer painting called The Spirit of 76. You've probably seen recreated numerous times for numerous reasons, and that phrase, the spirit of 76, and various permutations of it are used both to evoke a sense of national unity and the ever-permanent threat of tumultuous, violent revolution enshrined in the American Constitution, both literally and figuratively. My interpretation of Heinlein's use of this nursery rhyme is both as a rallying cry for that same spirit of 76 that, in Heinlein's eyes, would have represented the spiritual heart of his book and provided an ordinal marker for the growth of young Johnny Rico as we're introduced to him here. The song itself represents Rico, who is a scruffy, unfocused, and untrained boy, but also in whom lays the inborn and natural spirit of the man he might become. A man of action, education, discipline, and selfless esprit de corps who will embody the heart, soul, and spirit of Heinlein's new civilization. But at the time we're introduced to Rico, he's still a rudderless, spoiled civilian with no dreams whatsoever of military service. I never really intended to join up, and certainly not the infantry. Why, I would have rather taken 10 lashes in the public square and have my father tell me that I was a disgrace to a proud name. The early portions of this chapter introduce us to Rico's high school friend Carl, who he's been close to essentially throughout his boyhood. Carl is from a considerably less affluent family, and so the prospects of a career in the military and the benefits offered through service are much more enticing to him. We find out here that military service is the first completely free decision anybody can make as an adult in this society. That service is a codified right, and nobody can stand in the way of the individual and a term of service. This is used to articulate the start of the conflict between Rico and his father, a wealthy businessman, who wants Rico to have nothing to do with military service and offers him a series of bribes, barbs, and ultimatums to keep him from joining. We also meet Jean Dubois, in the first of a series of Johnny's reminiscences of the man. Dubois is an instructor in history and moral philosophy, a job that can only be held by veterans and must be attended, though not necessarily passed, by all students before graduating high school. While neither Dubois or Rico's father are present for a majority of the book to come, they form, respectively, the true protagonistic and antagonistic forces in Heinlein's Troopers. Rico's father represents the effete, high-minded, and property-focused liberal who selfishly can only see the world, and the people in it, through the lens of his own perception of personal value. Rico's father is self-centered, ignoring the needs and motivations of others, and often outright impugning them to poison the well against people in his mind, so he doesn't have to meet them on his level. He insinuates that Dubois is ill-intentioned, and possibly even a foreigner of some sort. He suggests Rico's friend Carl is a good boy, but misguided in some way. This all leads up to his distaste for the military itself and, therefore, the very society in which he lives. We've outgrown wars. This planet is now peaceful and happy, and we enjoy good enough relations with other planets. So what is this so-called federal service? Parasitism, pure and simple. A functionless organ, utterly obsolete, living on the taxpayers, a decidedly expensive way for inferior people who otherwise would be unemployed to live at public expense for a term of years, then give themselves heirs for the rest of their lives. Is that what you want to do? Depending on your background, this speech might range from insane sounding to essentially common knowledge, but the sentiment is anything but new. Militaries are expensive to man, maintain, and modernize, and when there is no obvious threat, the military loses its obvious value. And, as discussed earlier in this video, a trend toward demilitarization in supposed peacetime was something Heinlein perceived as a massive threat to America and shared American ideals abroad. In Rico's father, we see highlighted the most callous anti-militarist position and the most selfish, that of avoiding the sheer cost of a standing military. But in Dubois, we find the counterpoint by establishing the absolute selflessness of a volunteer military, and the necessity of such to defend all other such values Rico's father and society at large might hold. Rico takes us through his final day of school, where Dubois is trying to pick at his students to see what they learned during history and moral philosophy. The bleeding heart liberal position is played by some nameless girl, not Carmen as in the film, who goes through the violence never solves anything argument with Dubois. Of course, in Heinlein, it's not Hiroshima, but Carthage which forms the focal point of this interaction, which we discussed earlier. In the novel, however, Dubois' argument is further clarified that violence is a persistent and universal constant, and that the natural punishment for failing to prepare for and return violence is extermination. Violence, naked force, has settled more issues in history than has any other factor, and the contrary opinion is wishful thinking at its worst. Breeds that forget this basic truth have always paid for it with their lives and freedoms. Dubois finishes up this section by having Rico dance with, what we'll discover throughout this book, is the answer to the brutalist assertion above. He asks Rico, what is the moral difference, if any, between the soldier and the civilian? To which Johnny provides the textbook response. The difference, I answered carefully, lies in the field of civic virtue. A soldier accepts personal responsibility for the safety of the body politic of which he is a member, defending it, if need be, with his life. The civilian does not. Dubois remarks that it's clear Rico knows the answer, but fails to more deeply understand the answer. This is not just a note for Rico, but for the reader as well. Heinlein has just laid out the heart of his military philosophy and said, essentially, that he's about to spend the duration of the time that follows catching the reader up on exactly why these hard, for a child, to understand truths are both necessary for the continuation of society, but also attainable only under certain circumstances. That will be the rest of the book though, so I'll save summaries until the end. After leaving high school with Rico, we can now move on at a much quicker pace. We're introduced to Carmencita, who Rico has known his entire life as well, but isn't an established paramour as in Verhoeven's adaptation. She is a small, indiscreet math genius and for all those reasons a perfect candidate for military service as a pilot. She meets Rico as he's walking Carl to the enlistment center and, in a moment of bravado, Rico decides to enlist to impress Carmen. She, in turn, impresses the recruitment officer, who promptly sends her up to administrative processing and completely out of the novel until nearly the end chapters. Carl and Rico are left to contend with the recruiter who, much like in the movie, has been afflicted with amputations in the course of his service. He goes out of his way, quite explicitly, to dissuade Carl and Rico from joining. "So they put me out here to discourage you boys. Look at this." He shoved his chair around to make sure that we could see that he was legless. "Let's assume you don't wind up digging tunnels on Luna or playing human guinea pig for new diseases through sheer lack of talent. Suppose we do make a fighting man out of you. And take a look at me. This is what you may buy if you don't buy the whole farm and cause your folks to receive a deeply regret telegram." Carl and Johnny both decide to stick with it anyway and enlist. In this time, we discover the military is organized with a fairly massive contingent of civilian contractors, in this case a doctor. He provides us a sort of glimpse into the civilian opinion of the government, which essentially boils down to the fact that everybody has a group of professionals they think should be in charge. For him, it's the medical class. We also find out that enlistment service covers a period of at least 2 years, but can actually be extended indefinitely based on military necessity, and that you get 48 hours to regret your decision and take it back after enlisting. However, you lose the chance to join up forever if you pull the ripcord here, as they say. Rico's parents' reactions to his enlistment are covered in all of 2 sentences that may be summarized as upset. and then we find out what his military occupation specialty will be. It's not called this here, but in most modern militaries, MOS, or military occupational specialty, it might be called something else, but it always means basically the same thing, is the specific job you have in the military. All militaries throughout history have had delineations between at least some disciplines: crossbowman, cavalry, archer, but particularly in modern militaries, the jobs are as highly specific as what any civilian might do for a living. The other military jobs are pretty banal: power room technician, cook, pilot, those are in the Navy. But Rico ends up getting pushed toward Army jobs through a series of aptitude and psych tests. K9 teams are the coolest, by the way, and those are not in the movie. They're basically mobile infantry, but with genetically enhanced neo-dogs that form symbiotic bonds with their handlers. Heinlein could have written an entire million-word series about neo-dog teams, and I would have read every word, but he had his panties in a bunch about nukes, so we got this. Rico, obviously, goes mobile infantry and, thus, gets orders to report to boot camp. We have the first of many scenes, this with his recruiter, where he runs into someone he knows or knew, and they find out how far he's come in his MI journey and give him a pat on the back. This feeling is whiplashed when Rico talks to his temporary bunkmate before shipping out to boot camp, who tells him he's a poor, stupid clown for going MI. Rico ends the chapter by threatening his bunkmate with a mouthful of knuckles. This highlights an issue both that Heinlein wanted to show in Starship Troopers and that exists in the real world: a genuine disrespect for ground infantrymen as dolts and barbarians. You can believe that if you want to. As a former infantryman myself, I don't particularly mind either way, but in Starship Troopers, it's important that Heinlein shows this lack of respect as par for the course. Because, as we'll see, the mobile infantry not just understanding that they're fighting, but why they're fighting is critical. And if you don't respect the intelligence of the man making that decision, you can't respect the decision itself. And decision is absolutely necessary in Heinlein's philosophy, for a military to not just be moral, but also effective. And if that feels, to any degree, anti-fascist, well, it is. Part 3.3: Making a Mobile Infantryman. Chapter 3 begins and then proceeds much more simply than its predecessors. With only Revelations 11:25, he shall rule them with a rod of iron. The deeper meaning to that is just Rico and his fellow boots get the daylights kicked out of them for the next many pages. We're introduced to a number of new characters here, but the only particularly important one is Career Ship's Sergeant Zim, who serves as Rico's head drill instructor. We get a very similar introduction to him as in Verhoeven's adaptation, though he's a touch more educational while lightly maiming his recruits. "You apes! No, not apes! You don't rate that much! You pitiful mob of sickly monkeys, you sunken-chested, slack-bellied, drooling refugees from apron strings. In my whole life I never saw such a disgraceful huddle of mama's spoiled little darlings, and you there, suck up the gut, eyes front, I'm talking to you!" We blow through Chapter 3 with Zim browbeating and actually beating on his recruits, and move cleanly into Chapter 4 continuing along the same line. There's more on-the-nose Bible quotes, these from Judges Chapter 7 verses 2-7, paraphrased basically, weed out those who won't be useful to God's purpose. And to my own purposes, I will do the same here. I'm not going to mention the names and backgrounds of all the characters here, or generally most of the characters that are introduced after this point who don't have some critical connection to Heinlein's philosophy. Just understand this, nearly everybody in this book that Rico meets dies way off screen, just off screen, or at best, right in front of him with all the passionate departure of water off a duck's back. The entire boot camp experience is a bit insane. And I attribute that to Heinlein's expertise in the subject being crafted by going to the early 1900s version of Naval Officer Candidate School and Annapolis before that. I actually did go to infantry school and enlisted boot camp, those both being in the Marine Corps, and I can see how a squid officer looking in from the outdoor might translate our sort of training into a seemingly pointless death march when trying to gin it up for a sci-fi setting. We do get yelled at and drilled mercilessly, though by the time I was in, they'd stopped, generally, putting hands on recruits. Fighting with recruits at all would be a serious infraction on the drill instructor's part. Deaths at recruit training were also completely avoidable in almost all circumstances outside of a freak accident, and exceptionally rare by the time I went to boot camp in Paris Island in the summer of 2005. Mobile Infantry Boot Camp in Heinlein's Troopers combines roughly a year or so's worth of training for multiple disciplines in today's military into a single experience of undefined length in the book. Some internet sleuths I've looked at suggest the total time of his boot camp is around 12 to 14 months, using context clues given throughout Starship Troopers. One of the longest training periods in my own branch of service, the United States Marine Corps, is for that of Marine Force Recon, our Special Forces Division. That comprises about 62 total weeks of training, spread out across several different schools, from basic training standard to all recruits to advanced warfare training such as jump school throughout the country. I bring all this up because it's one of the most notable problems with Heinlein's novel, that the eponymous troopers are both highly valuable and nearly impossible to make, with insane training times and an attrition rate of around 91%. Many of those recruits also just die during training, which is insanely, and I would say unnecessarily harsh. At one point, Rico is dropped literally naked into the Canadian Rockies and subsists on rabbits. And that simple paragraph is light compared to some of the other dumb shit they do in boot camp. Most notably, they have blank fire exercises with some real ammunition mixed in, fired from old school rifles. This and every other thing is described as necessary to the overall plan of hardening up mobile infantry recruits to become good CAV troopers. But it honestly reads like Heinlein took the banalities of standard military training and turned everything up to 11, even when it doesn't make sense. This, alongside the absolutely nonsensical tactics of the mobile infantry, once we get to see them in action, are my two largest issues with Heinlein's novel as far as its construction and world building. Everything's told through the eyes of Johnny Rico, who describes the world through simple, uncluttered observation and muted, shrugging speculation whenever describing something he can't immediately see. Rico himself is a largely incurious and unexcitable character. Throughout the book, he's rarely personally interested in much outside of women, he's a big fan, jewelry, unexpected but fine, and power suits, which who wouldn't be? His incuriousness provides Heinlein with a great tool to mold his ideal world for us. Rico is generally accepting of things as they come, and doesn't much care about things he can't or couldn't understand. Thus, we don't have a great deal of hard, materialist questions or answers provided to us in the narrative. The hows of this universe are strictly ideological, and thus it follows that the whys are similarly dispossessed. And through all this is ultimately distilled a binary perception of the world at hand. There is what is, the status quo, and what might be, a different and opposing and absolutely other status quo. And between these absolute forces is the simple inevitability of violence, because neither status quo can exist in tandem with the other. The purpose of Johnny Rico is to show the gradual merger and synthesis of institutionality, heritage, and violence with the human animal to create Heinlein's new ideal. In this case, the mobile infantryman. The human animal, Apes, his instructor calls him and the other recruits, is possessed of a great many conflicting emotions and weaknesses, selfishness the most destructive amongst all of them. Through military training, the absolution of the self and therefore selfishness can be achieved, allowing an evolved human to spring forth. But this is only the first stage in the evolution of the new ideal, as we'll see throughout Troopers. And if this all sounds a touch too academic, that's good. You'd make a terrific mobile infantryman. War is not violence and killing, pure and simple. War is controlled violence for a purpose. The purpose of war is to support your government's decisions by force. The purpose is never to kill the enemy just to be killing him, but to make him do what you want him to do. But it's not your purpose or mine to decide the purpose of the control. It's never a soldier's business to decide when or where or how or why he fights. That belongs to the statesmen and the generals. The statesmen decide why and how much. The generals take it from there and tell us where and when and how. We supply the violence. Other people, older and wiser heads as they say, supply the control, which is as it should be. That's the best answer I can give you. If it doesn't satisfy you, I'll get you a chit to talk to the regimental commander. If he can't convince you, then go home and be a civilian, because in that case you will certainly never make a soldier. This is a speech that's in response to the knife question, that gets a knife through Jake Busey's hands in the Verhoeven adaptation. but in the original novel it receives a much more interesting response. The question of why is, essentially, responded to with, "I don't know, and it's not for me to know, and if you have a problem with that, then you cannot be one of us." This question is asked by Hendrik, whose closest equivalent in the Verhoeven adaptation may be Verhoeven himself. It's interesting, at least, that Verhoeven's alteration to this for the adaptation is, essentially, because fuck you, that's why, and here's a knife in your hand. And most certainly, that change in the general reaction to this scene is probably the best point to truly put your finger on where Verhoeven, mistakenly in my opinion, veers off, because Hendrik's character is crucial to understanding the point of Heinlein's novel. I'd like to take a second here to break down Heinlein's writing style, at least as far as Starship Troopers is concerned. I haven't read much of anything of his other work, particularly his fiction, so I wouldn't be surprised to find out Starship Troopers is the only thing he made that follows this very distinct rhythm. It is, essentially, a Bildungsroman, which is often misunderstood to mean coming of age, but is more specifically a novel about one's formative, often moral, education, and not necessarily their departure from youth. The distinction is small but significant for literary analysis, particularly in Heinlein's Troopers, where Rico is already a fully developed individual. His first major decision in the book is quite explicitly described as the first real decision an adult can make in the Terran Federation, joining federal service. But more to the point, Rico himself doesn't grow in any grand or meaningful way. His disposition, his outlook, the way he interacts with knowledge and the world change almost not at all from the first pages to the last. He has no youthful caprices that hinder his passage to adulthood. He makes no discoveries about his transition from boy to man. No, he is, in all senses, internally perfect for Heinlein's purposes, and all his growth and development is merely taking that which is natural in Rico as an ideal civilian and lightly refining them to perfection, more pruning a grown bush for presentation than raising it from seed, as coming of age would suggest. More deeply, this creates a sense of the structure of a religious text. Parables, books of law, and literal hymns interspersed through a catchframe of those sorts of ambling details that make up, for instance, the Christian Bible. There's even hints of the Messianic and a section on begatting, though in the analogous sense, which we'll get to. It is, I think most inarguably, an old man's retelling of a young man's life made with little consideration to the interests of young men. This doesn't mean that no young man would find interest in Starship Troopers, but rather that in his telling of the story, Heinlein focuses largely not on the adventure of life, but its moral lessons. In a sort of perfect inversion of a well-told hero story for boys, we experience all the conflict, the heroism, and the overcoming of adversity almost completely secondhand. The typical rhythm is thus: a few pages of things Rico did that were quite fun or dangerous or exciting, but not told explicitly. You get meager details at about a paragraph per, until finally one of those paragraphs ends in a meandering lesson about the value of a well-organized society. Only then will you be dropped back into the action, play for play, but it won't be soaring around in robot suits, shooting missiles and fighting bug creatures. It'll be moments like the following plotting administrative scene. Hendrik, the recruit who initiated the long conversation with Zim about the duties of a soldier, is dragged to his training unit's company commander, Captain Frankel, for punching Sergeant Zim during an exercise. We discovered that Hendrik failed to freeze, a very real, but considerably less extreme, command in the real-life military wherein the individual is expected to drop to the ground and cease moving, or simply cease moving without dropping, until released. There's a variety of reasons this command or similar commands might be called in real life, mostly not to be noticed, but I saw it most consistently used in boot camp to quell the general disorder that arose from several dozen teenage boys losing their minds under stress. In this case, Hendrik failed to comply with the freeze command because he'd stopped on a red ant nest. It's made fairly obvious through Rico's perspective that Hendrik has no idea how much trouble he's actually in, and essentially everybody is trying to get him to shut up before he digs himself any further, which, of course, he doesn't do. Hendrik argues himself deeper and deeper, while Zim never so much as mentions what's happened. Eventually, Hendrik reveals that he willingly struck Zim outside of a permitted training engagement, and things completely fall out for him. Captain Frankel, having known that Hendrik hit Zim but not having to act on the issue until it was spoken aloud, court-martials Hendrik and reveals the maximum punishment could be death. All the while, Hendrik had thought he'd just wash out of basic training. The court does not permit you to resign. The court wishes to add that your punishment is light simply because this court possesses no jurisdiction to assign greater punishment. The authority which remanded you specified a field court-martial. Why it so chose, this court will not speculate. But had you been remanded for general court-martial, it seems certain that the evidence before this court would have caused a general court to sentence you to hang by the neck until dead. You are very lucky, and the remanding authority has been most merciful. Hendrik fumbles through his own self-defense in a fairly pitiful fashion, and is sentenced to 10 lashes and a bad conduct discharge. He's publicly flogged, and that's the end of Hendrik in the story. It should be said that the public flogging is described as being awful to watch, and that a couple dozen recruits, to include Rico, pass out from the sheer shock of seeing it. There is an impression that Heinlein revels in public spectacle and retributory violence in this book, but everything in the text shows it only as an unfortunate necessity of society and disturbing to boot. I'll prove that in a moment, but first I want to talk about how good this scene is at executing subtext. Now, obviously, at the most surface level of world building, this scene shows us the brutal potential of military punishment and the extraordinary repercussions for otherwise minor offenses in the civilian world. Going just a step deeper shows the darker implication of Hendrik's shortcomings. Being unable to take a few red ant bites in training could easily extrapolate out to cowardice in the face of the real bugs, the pseudo-arachnids. Of course, he might have died if he stayed on the nest, but in Heinlein's philosophy, it would be better for him to be injured, even die, on the nest and prove his dedication to his fellow soldiers, than risk him going to a hive world and putting them all at risk there. But Heinlein, in this scene and the scene previous, takes us very far into his ideology with Hendrik. Deeper still than the allusion to the bugs, we're shown one of the most insidious dangers to this society, the exceptional failure, a living conundrum whose very existence tests even Sergeant Zim, an absolute paragon of the Terran Federation. It isn't just that Hendrik fails, it's that his physical and mental competency are so effective at hiding his extreme moral shortcomings that he, essentially, catches Sergeant Zim spiritually unaware, as Zim himself says. He was so earnest, so doggedly determined to sweat it out. He didn't have any aptitude, but he kept on trying. That I must have done that, subconsciously. Zim was silent, then added, I guess it was because I liked him. Frankel snorted. An instructor can't afford to like a man. Zim's words might not echo my former assertions of Hendrik's competency, but think of it this way. At this point, we're on the other side of all the nightmarish training that Rico's been through. Naked rabbit hunting, endless running, sleeping in the wild, and playing soldier with a mix of planks and live rounds. Hendrik pushed through all of that, determined to sweat it out. Even if he wasn't exceptional, he was a fair sight more competent than your average human by any metric. I say all this because it sets the stage for the social progression that must come as part of Rico's maturation into the, if not ruling class, then administrative and pedagogic class of this society, that of its officers. The above quote comes in the chapter following the events of Hendrik's court-martial, when Zim and Captain Frankel have switched gears into post-punishment debriefing. We find that Zim is, in fact, emotionally fraught over the incident and even asked to resign his position overseeing the recruits to return to the MI as a grunt. He's denied his wish on orders from Frankel and accepts without additional pushback, going back to training afterward as though nothing had happened. During this scene, we learn a few things. That, in this society, it is the leadership of the society that is ultimately responsible for the shortcomings of its subordinate classes in all possible manifestations. It had better be done. I will not only break the instructor who slips, I will personally take him way out on the prairie and give him lumps. Because I will not have another one of my boys strung up to that whipping post through sloppiness on the part of his teachers. Dismissed. We're further clarified on this later, but we've been given hints all along to this end. It is the parent who is responsible for the child, both their life and their development. The training sergeant for the recruit, the officer for the enlisted, even the more powerful nation is responsible for the behavior of its weaker counterpart. In the conversation leading up to Zim's speech on the nature of a soldier's responsibility toward violence, he gives an extremely interesting response to the question of why one would need to mitigate violence in a fight between superpowers. That is, why would one need to learn to use a knife when one could simply press a button and fire an atomic weapon? To which he essentially responds, "If you wanted to teach a baby a lesson, would you cut its head off?" Even in the case of nations, or here, technically entire worlds, violence isn't presented as blunt, simplistic, or without consequence. Not only can it be measured, but it must as a matter of course, and that measure must be consummate with the lesson at hand. We are, herein, given suggestions that, in Heinlein's philosophy, violence is education and, therefore, a deep moral and historical appreciation for violence and its measures and its implementations must be taught. Even that lesson itself is taught through violence, as we'll learn, but can also already see through the youthful education of children who will remember the violence, either first or second hand, and therein replicate its lessons throughout life and, at some point, wield it for the betterment of society in their own hands. What is explicated in Hendrik's actions and character is a departure from violence in the questioning of its efficacy, and in the lack of respect for violence. In this questioning of violence, we see Heinlein shine a light on the depths of the young man's selfishness. If violence is a perpetual rule, then violence must be respected. He is afflicted by the violence of the ant and so risks the theoretical lives of his recruit squad mates to stand up. But when met by the violence of his instructor, he lashes out at him, attempting to quell Zim with his own meager violence. But he never questions the natural violence of the ants, which is unrelenting and constant and inherent to the creature. A true natural state he is trying to arrive at through his own training, but his mind isn't focused on that. He's only sticking out for his own reasons, and not for any greater purpose than that. While Rico, and likely the other recruits, have not actively articulated selfless goals, they also haven't articulated a specifically selfish one, as Hendrik has. But because he's kept up with them, his selfishness is not obvious until it's too late to save him from it. Zim fails Hendrik, and it's suggested that in another society Hendrik might survive that failure to continue on into the ranks of the ruling class. He meant to go into politics. He talked a lot about how, when he got his citizenship, there will be some changes made. You wait and see. But Hendrik is, thankfully, in a narrative sense, caught out before he can both literally and figuratively become a harm to society. Not by any individual, but by the society itself. Pragmatic rules laid down for just such an occasion and the generations of training and education needed to create an officer class with the literal jurisprudence to execute such laws. In this not-so-short exchange with Frankel and its aftermath, we see in Frankel an absolutely duty-driven manipulation of the legal system for the strict benefit of the recruits and, therefore, society at large. He doesn't scrutinize and doesn't openly think about the situation at hand. He trusts in his subordinates and, therefore, the system that trained them to deliver a satisfactory conclusion to the issue at hand. Frankel actively ignores Zim's injury, and Zim actively avoids discussing it, or the circumstances, even though it's, quite literally, written on his face what happened. In his discretion as an officer, Frankel allows the situation to play out to the exact point where society requires him to act, and then he does, which creates the best possible situation. Hendrik is given ample opportunity to voluntarily, that term again, shut his own mouth and take the most recent and worst punishment offered, but is so self-obsessed he keeps going. When he finally volunteers the information that he willingly struck his superior, only then does society itself dictate Frankel's actions, which are to court-martial Hendrik out of the military. If Frankel would have coddled Hendrik, or Zim continued to coddle him, then Hendrik might have one day achieved his goal of changing society for the better. Thus, Heinlein shows us his society is self-correcting and self-propagating, if only because of the good work of generations. Regardless of whether you love or hate the message at hand, it is unfathomably excellent writing and world building. Even so that fully unpacking it requires almost in toto the entirety of what I've written up till now to prove even just this point. More importantly, I want to hammer home that despite his few faults in constructing Troopers as a holistic experience, this philosophical underpinning is baked into every aspect of the narrative. That is to say, you're not going to undo the messaging of a creator this talented by making a few goofy-ass commercials. But I digress. The Hendrik scene and its aftermath lead into Rico's own crisis of conscience, in which he sees in himself the same weaknesses which led Hendrik to failure. What is really happening is that Rico is having a literal epiphany about the world, the first and most profound of a few that eventually lead to his realizing Heinlein's ideals. Hendrik's punishment and Zim's self-flagellation over the event, which Rico spied on, have given Rico pause to consider whether he should continue on in this profession or just wash out and return to civilian life. These scenes feel lightly illusory to the temptations of Christ, which is no great leap given Heinlein's profuse religiosity throughout Starship Troopers. Near the end of the story, Rico is literally knocked unconscious, buried, dragged out by his followers, and then rises after a few days, but that's not important. He's tempted by his own mother when she writes him a forgiving, infantilizing letter, literally writing him that, "Little boys never get over needing their mother's laps, do they, darling?" Rico finds strength in the words of his spiritual father, Dubois, from whom he also receives a letter. This commiserating with him about the miseries of boot camp and urging him to understand he's at the hump of his training, literally describing it as a spiritual mountaintop. The letter culminates in articulating, essentially, the apotheosis of the boot camp scenes and Hendrik's punishment. The noblest fate that a man can endure is to place his own mortal body between his loved home and the war's desolation. The words are not mine, of course, as you will recognize. Basic truths cannot change, and once a man of insight expresses one of them, it is never necessary, no matter how much the world changes, to reformulate them. This is an immutable, true everywhere, throughout all time, for all men and all nations. We find out that Jean Dubois was a lieutenant colonel and Zim's commander at some point in the mobile infantry, further tying together the narrative of military heritage and tradition that runs through Troopers. By this point in the novel, Rico's found an entirely new patronage outside his literal bloodline, and his own feckless, selfish father is still not writing him, which continues a slightly less explored but powerfully suggested theme of throwing off worthless and ineffectual parentage, alluded to in a quick section on the shortcomings of Karl Marx. There's a great deal of opining I'll spare you on the nature of the Marxian theory of value, followed by the suggestion that even market value is an illusory concept which Rico believes his wealthy, business-owning father would consider a stupid proposal. The ultimate theory is that of the relative theory of value, by which I think Heinlein actually just means the use theory of value, but that's neither here nor there, and I'm no economics expert in any case. Heinlein, through Dubois, has an extremely tenuous and at times non-existent level of expertise on various bits of philosophy he wants to discuss throughout the book. This isn't to say I'm right and he's not either. I think it's either a case of his understandings of the topics circa 1958 might be somewhat outdated or are just argued in ways that don't mirror most modern argumentation either for or against. This isn't always the case, and certainly these are topics where all experts end up as an army of themselves, so I could be just as wrong. Treat us all with grace, dear listener. Either way, right around the start of Chapter 7, Heinlein finally runs out of things to do in boot camp that he can connect to his philosophy, so he just sort of stops talking about boot camp. I'm not exaggerating either. Johnny Rico says that. I'm not going to talk much more about my boot training. Mostly it was simple work, but I was squared away. Enough said. This is a fucking lie, because we stay at boot camp for quite a while longer, but switch to power suit training. And the power suits are cool, but they're also not very important to the overall themes of the book, so I won't dwell on them long. Suffice to say, Chapter 7 is Heinlein's The Whiteness of the Whale, but for sick-ass power armor. This passage sums up basically everything you need to know. A suit isn't a spacesuit, although it can serve as one. It is not primarily armor, although the Knights of the Round Table were not as armored as well as we are. It isn't a tank, but a single MI private could take on a squadron of those things and knock them off unassisted if anybody was silly enough to put tanks against MI. A suit is not a ship, but it can fly, a little. On the other hand, neither spaceships nor atmosphere craft can fight against a man in a suit except by saturation bombing of the area he is in, like burning down a house to get one flea. Contrary-wise, we can do many things that no ship, air, submersible, or space, can do. This chapter is where Rico finally gets in trouble by executing a maneuver that endangers, theoretically, his squad mates during a simulation exercise. In summary, he makes a lazy, selfish decision to save on time during a training exercise that might not even necessarily have injured anybody in a real mission. However, his departure from doctrine requires punishment, which he receives without complaint. This is the "it helps, I know" scene with Zim that's repeated in the Verhoeven adaptation, and is honestly no less poignant in either rendition. At least that part. But what's really accomplished is simply showing Rico overcoming the moral failings that destroyed Hendrik. Despite Rico's earlier suggestion that he was done talking about boot camp, we actually continue talking about boot camp into the next chapter, 8, which makes a return to the Bible quotes with Proverbs 22:6, "Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it." This chapter concerns Terran society's provisions for the death penalty and some other laws. It's explicitly stated that deserters aren't looked for from boot camp or otherwise, on account of the fact that the entire solar system is one government and there's nowhere really to go. The punishment for desertion is dishonorable discharge and 50 lashes. In real life, it's just the discharge and possibly some jail time, unless you desert in a combat zone. We find out now that one of the recruits who'd originally been assigned to Rico's training regiment deserted, and in the interim has killed a baby girl. What follows is a few pages of Heinlein doing the "imagine the worst crime ever" variant of pro-death penalty laws argument, and giving some background on the case. This eventually leads to another trip back to Dubois' high school classroom, and then further into several pages of justification for the death penalty, for corporal punishment of adults and minors, and then a great deal of semantics. Pedantics, really, regarding specifically the term cruel and unusual punishment. I don't find Heinlein's route of argumentation particularly novel or compelling, but again, that's mostly because the book is simply quite old and all of the arguments surrounding this topic have evolved in every direction. I'll venture that even fervent supporters of the ideas he espouses would, after agreeing, still have a good many pointers they'd like to bring up to help him be more effective at his argumentation, but largely, that's the point I really want to hit home here, that you can see the progenitor ideas of basically all conservative, and especially American evangelical-style theocratic fascism laid out perfectly in their nascence. I will argue there is not a single hyper-conservative idea that exists today that doesn't by some permutation lead back to nearly every fundamental outlook espoused by this book. Which is why I think everybody should read it. Whether you're trying to be a better fascist or better beat fascists, it's all here in plain black and white. But more importantly, why it's appealing is here, and we'll get to that fully before the end, but I've pretty much already laid it out for you at this point, as has Heinlein. Just a note for clarification here, I don't believe that Heinlein invented these ideas, which should be obvious, but you never know. My primary assertion in the temporal sense is that he happened to write an extremely influential book at a discrete time in American history where the people who now run the world were in their short pants. Either way, what this somewhat rambling chapter on crime and punishment, which takes up many of the interior pages of a book that's supposed to be about killing giant space bugs in power armor, is trying to accomplish, is establishing the concept of moral objectivism and the inherent immorality of the human animal. Another anonymous girl from Rico's class, possibly the same from the Fall of Carthage discussion in the earliest pages of the book again, but who knows, engages in a quick bit of dialectic with Dubois. In this, he establishes a few snap assertions that corporal punishment in measure is absolutely essential for the education of all, even remotely intelligent creatures, using dogs and humans as an example. This is because there is no inherent morality in the human animal, and it must be taught through violence. And it must be taught through violence because only the individual's instinct to survive, to avoid pain, can be molded into the subtle motivations on which the whole of society is founded. Thus, we are returned to lessons of violence, selflessness, and heritage first established in Hendrik's Crime and Punishment. Young lady, What you miscall your moral instinct was the instilling in you by your elders of the truth that survival can have stronger imperatives than that of your own personal survival. Survival of your family, for example. Of your children, when you have them. Of your nation, if you struggle that high up the scale. And so on up. A scientifically verifiable theory of morals must be rooted in the individual's instinct to survive. And nowhere else. And must correctly describe the hierarchy of survival, note the motivations at each level, and resolve all conflicts. Dubois finally summarizes. But all moral problems can be illustrated by one misquotation. Greater love hath no man than a mother cat dying to defend her kittens. This chapter essentially summarizes the entirety of Heinlein's issues with American liberalism there at the end of the 1950s. He calls out, specifically, the founding ideals articulated in the U.S. Declaration of Independence, the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Heinlein, arguing through Dubois, suggests a line of argumentation straight out of Jeremy Bentham's writing, that natural laws are a rank impossibility because they're materially inconsistent with reality itself. Each year someone quotes that magnificent poetry. Life. What right to life has a man who is drowning in the Pacific? The ocean will not hearken to his cries. Understand, however, that Heinlein is not arguing against those rights or their value, save for the pursuit of happiness, which he says is just a universal condition, merely that they are not natural to the human condition and must be secured in a material sense, often at great cost, and that security must be maintained. This leads into a somewhat pedantic but infuriatingly fair, in my opinion, redefinition of juvenile delinquent that forms the heart of Heinlein's argument against American liberalism. He states, a delinquent is one who is failing in their duty, and because duty can only be an adult virtue both by law and by situation, a juvenile cannot be delinquent. If you've been paying attention, we are retreading the same ground again, but more explicitly this time. Dubois states that, essentially, an overemphasis on protecting the so-called natural rights of the individual and conferring those rights on children that had no duty to act in accordance with the rights of others created a societal sickness that destroyed the North American Republic back in the 20th century. At that time, Rico recalls, crimes like the one committed by Dillinger, the deserter who killed the little girl, were rampant. Law-abiding people, Dubois had told us, hardly dared to go into a public park at night. To do so is to risk attack by wolf packs of children, armed with chains and knives, homemade guns, bludgeons. To be hurt, at least, robbed most certainly, injured for life probably, or even killed. Now, some modern readers I think have conflated the term children to simply mean pre-adolescence, but it's fairly obvious Heinlein means street gangs of teenagers. Probably there might be some children throw in there if you pressed him, but there's nothing to be gained in interpretation by pretending he was terrified of 6-year-olds with switchblades in public parks after sunset. Either way, his proffered fix, extolled as the only effective cure by his futuristic stand-in, is to give kids a good paddling. The basis of all morality is duty, a concept with the same relation to the group that self-interest has to individual. Nobody preached duty to these kids in a way they could understand, that is, with a spanking. But the society they were in told them endlessly about their rights. Ultimately, Rico himself is unsure what to make of Dillinger's criminal actions and how to judge him through the lens of Dubois' instruction. Was he a boy who was failed by the system, or a man who failed his own duties in acting the way he did? As with most difficult quandaries, Rico decides the decision is above his pay grade and finds solace only in the death of a child murderer who will never again be able to kill a little girl. I can summarize the end of Johnny's boot camp phase of his career with a quote from the man himself at the end of Chapter 9, 32 pages after Chapter 7, when he said he wasn't going to write about boot camp anymore. Eventually, we graduated. Literally not much happens all of Chapter 9 save for that and Rico's first Liberty Pass, basically a type of weekend in the military where you can leave base. And more of these non-events that happen paragraph by paragraph until he goes on a short vacation to Vancouver. There he gets into a fight with some locals, by which I mean he and 2 of his boot buddies beat the shit out of them, and the local authorities basically tell them it's all good. This is also about the most total information you get about the Terran Federation as far as civilian life goes, and it's sparse. There are merchant marines, they are drunken reprobates, and they start fights they can't win. People get shit-faced and dressed like slobs in the future, at least when they're not clean-cut military boys like Rico. Not much to glean, even less to say, but I think I should add this chapter ends with the most depressing couple of paragraphs. Mostly because Heinlein hints at all these interesting moments, bad weather, and firefights that Rico and his squad mates thought were simulations but were actually real. Literal adventures that all have to take a backseat to the politics Rico was literally and figuratively created as a vehicle for. Most crushing are the graduation stats for this absolute meat grinder of a boot camp. The regiment had started with 2,009 men. We graduated 187. Of the others, 14 were dead, 1 executed and his name struck, and the rest resigned, dropped, transferred, medical discharge, etc. Major Malloy made a short speech. We each got a certificate. We passed in review for the last time, and the regiment was disbanded, its colors to be cased until they would be needed, 3 weeks later, to tell another couple thousand civilians that they were an outfit, not a mob. Part 3.4 The Bug War. Proceeding into the second half of the book, we experience, alongside Rico, a sort of whiplash moment common amongst service members, that of the transition from trained recruit to full-time soldier. While the distinction must be to some degree lost on civilians, in reality, much as in this novel, we see Rico being forced to reconcile the transition from training and simulation to full-stakes, real-life employment as an infantryman. The narrative, too, adjusts from the relative peacetime suggested by the first half of the story into a constant state of war. The historians can't seem to settle whether to call this one the Third Space War or the Fourth, or whether the First Interstellar War fits it better. We just call it the Bug War, if we call it anything, which we usually don't. And in any case, the historians date the beginning of the war after the time I joined my first outfit and ship. Everything up to then and still later were incidents, patrols, or police actions. This slow, meandering, and somewhat meaningless transition from general peace into constant, interstellar conflict is not just an inevitability in Heinlein's deeper philosophy, but an illusion. Conflict is constant in his eyes, and the terminology regarding the scale and scope of the conflict is largely most valuable only to those least involved in it. Peace is a condition in which no civilian pays any attention to military casualties which do not achieve page 1 lead story prominence, unless that civilian is a close relative of one of the casualties. But if there ever was a time in history when peace meant that there was no fighting going on, I have been unable to find out about it. When I reported to my first outfit, the fighting had already been going on for several years. This is something of a truism in reality as well. Biological existence is, itself, an act of conflict, with the environment, with the organisms one must eat to survive, and with other organisms who compete for your resources, bugs as much as people. Militaries the world over are constantly involved in conflict, though it might not be what one would call armed conflict. Conflict doesn't require physical aggression or warfare, particularly at the massive scale of nations and states. It can range from the petty and mundane to outright affronts to sovereignty, such as invasion. But the conflict is always there, and it is always inevitable. The solutions to the conflict are the only thing one might hope to have control over, and one of those aspects of control is the development and maintenance of a strong military. Throughout history, the act of peaceful conflict resolution through diplomacy has been predicated on the existence of a military both strong enough to resist the interference of other polities and to exert the threat of might if needs be. You can see this sort of peaceless peace in the modern era most perfectly represented in the conduction of drills. Drill is often the first bit of martial knowledge burned into the minds of recruits in basic training, and comprises, essentially, a way of showing off one's military bearing, discipline, and physical prowess. You move in unified formation, you display and interact with your service weapon, and you respond instantly to commands. Drills can be extrapolated out to scales that include and surpass the entirety of a nation's military, involving those of friendly militaries as well. This is all a way to show one's capability for violence without engaging in it, and is no different than the threat displays put on by animals. By displaying capability for violence, one places on the table the possibility of violence, without necessarily having to engage in it. Sometimes, obviously, this isn't enough, but in every time of peace in recorded history, it has been the way of things to some degree. And, of course, past this there are skirmishes, minor violent disputes, and a myriad other discrete acts of violence that act as prevention or prelude to outright warfare. But I digress. Rico is assigned to Willie's Wildcats, or Company K, 3rd Regiment, 1st MI Division aboard the Valley Forge. No battalion is given outright, but standard naming conventions would put any Kilo Company in 3rd Battalion, along with India, Juliet, and Lima companies. That's a little puzzle for you to figure out if you're bored. We see here one of the most fascinating bits of world building that's used immediately as a story beat and then never really returned to again. Rico sees his section leader in dress uniform. That's the most gussied up you get in military drag, wearing a golden skull and crossbones earring that he thinks looks awfully neat. He was wearing in his left earlobe a rather small earring, a tiny gold skull beautifully made, and under it, instead of the conventional crossed bones of the ancient Jolly Roger design, was a whole bundle of little golden bones, almost too small to see. The ornamentation, which Rico mentions he's slightly envious of, is an actual in-universe uniform item that serves as a casualty marker for men that have died alongside you in combat. Or, possibly, just combat drops where you suffer fatalities. But Heinlein is as entirely specific on that account that I can find. Either way, Rico gets his own shiny set of skull and bones soon as, essentially, his first official combat mission is Operation Bughouse, or the First Battle of Clendathu. It's as doomed in the book as it is in the movie, which is something of an unexpected development given how crucial and extremely effective military is to Heinlein's overall philosophy being presented here. We find out the Clendathu operation is a response to the smearing of Buenos Aires on Earth by a bug surprise attack, which Rico doesn't know at the time also killed his mother, but not his father in the book. The attack on Clendathu is what we in the business call a clusterfuck, and ends with massive casualties and the operation commander, General Deans, dying in a desperate diversionary attack to save the men still trapped on the planet's surface. The casual observer might point at this moment and blithely suggest that, even in his own work, Heinlein is pointing out, for some reason, the shortcomings of his own military organization. More likely, however, he's trying to paint a holistic picture of a military from the perspective of an actual former service member. Civilians, God bless all of you, have extremely skewed views of warfare, wherein success and failure are sheer and undeniable marks of competency. Thus, to fail is to be flawed, and through some additional leaps of logic, to fail is to prove the military is unjustified in its existence. But, in the real world, competency only goes so far. To err is human, and Heinlein repeatedly shows throughout Starship Troopers the errors of mankind, from the mundane to the stellar in scale. While planning for defeat carries significant negative connotations to the layperson, it's also something that must be done. Luck is a common currency on a battlefield, and as the old saying goes, men plan and God laughs. And so, here, Heinlein shows that even the most extraordinary failures of his proffered stratocracy have provisions in place for succession, for learning, and for adaptation. In showing the flaws of a single battle, he lays out the battle plan for the war. This has the unfortunate knock-on effect of him having to purposefully ankle his fictional military. They make a plethora of confusing, ineffectual, and at times outright foolish stumbles in their planning, which I don't know if I should attribute to intentionality on the part of Heinlein's writing, or him simply being a Navy man and less familiar with terrestrial operations. It should also be noted that he entered the military nearly 80 years before me, and so even the advanced education he received at Annapolis is wildly out of date with even the grunt-level modern military theory I was trained up in during the 2000s. All that said, in the book, the failure of Clendathu is largely attributed to the rumblings of beam counter interference with military command, and the genuinely terrifying nature of the novel's version of the bugs. The K-9 Corps especially takes horrific losses, with all the neo-dogs using dog suicide vests the second they came across the bugs out of sheer alien terror. Like I mentioned before, the bugs in Heinlein's novel are much more dangerous than those in the Verhoeven adaptation. They all look essentially the same, but only a small portion of the total figure are soldier bugs, and the rest are workers. Workers are mindless but harmless, and are mostly a threat only in that they dig tunnels and the inexperienced cap trooper might waste ammunition on them. The soldiers are often intermixed with them, and are built much the same, but unlike the Verhoeven adaptation, they can use spaceships and laser weapons that are highly effective against power armor. They're also impervious to pain or crippling injuries, and will fight well after being dealt a lethal injury if it doesn't immediately incapacitate them. You can burn off 1 leg, 2 legs, 3 legs, and he just keeps on coming. Burn off 4 on one side and he topples over, but keeps on shooting. You have to spot the nerve case and get it. Whereupon he will trot right on past you, shooting at nothing, until he crashes into a wall or something. Ultimately, this results in the understanding that combat with bugs is largely wasteful, unless you manage to eliminate a brain bug, but we get to that later. In the meantime, the operation has suffered something in the ballpark of 80% casualties, and Rico's unit especially has been near annihilated. He's folded into a new outfit, Ratchak's Roughnecks, named for Lieutenant Ratchak, who is, for the moment, still alive. In this section, we see the transformation from boot to salt dog, or whatever one might call it in other branches. Essentially, the moment where one transitions from being an untested, and therefore untrusted, new member of a unit, or the military in general, to having paid one's dues and being treated like an equal. And things are fairly egalitarian in the mobile infantry, especially comparing them against most historic military outfits. Most everybody has what we call in the Marine Corps a B-billet of sorts, a secondary occupation in addition to their main MOS that helps fill the roster on important duties. The men are cooks, mechanics. Rico's secondary job is electrical equipment maintenance. If a man didn't have any other talent, he could always scrub bulkheads. Nothing was ever quite clean enough to suit Sergeant Jalal. We followed the MI rule. Everybody fights. Everybody works. This is a change from the Verhoeven adaptation's everybody fights, nobody quits, that I think especially shows off that work's failure to, or desire not to, understand the novel's deeper premises. There is no sense of real camaraderie in the film. People get along, of course, and work and party together, but the deeper aspects of cohabitation, of getting along and selflessly working toward a larger goal are never really established. But selflessness is a crucial aspect of Heinlein's novel, and failing to understand, or outright cutting, these small domestic scenes of stakeholdership ignores why people might desire to live in a society that's not necessarily commensurate with one's own ideals. This idea is highlighted somewhat in a passage that occurs at the end of Chapter 10, wherein Rico finds out his mother was killed in the bug attack on Buenos Aires. He's crushed by her death, but focuses more on the letter that informed him of her passing, sent by his aunt Eleonora. His impression is that she blames the shortfallings of the military, and by association Rico, for his mother's death. And so, cut off from his father, and with his mother dead so many light years away, Rico is left with the family he's earned through blood, sweat, and tears. The Roughnecks, too, have lost their patriarch, Lieutenant Ratchak, who died in combat throwing injured men aboard a departing shuttle. I haven't mentioned the names of the private and of the assistant section leader on purpose. The lieutenant was making pickup on all of us, with his last breath. Maybe I was the private. It doesn't matter who he was. What did matter was that our family had its head chopped off. The head of the family from which we took our name. The father who made us what we were. In these final portions of this chapter, we're shown an extremely important moral conclusion in Heinlein's philosophy, the testing of the family unit, both natural and artificial, in a time of loss. Rico's biological family has failed him, abandoned him, and in multiple cases ostracized him when faced with any emotional difficulty. But his military family, reflected even in the struggles of the larger military itself, only grows stronger through adversity. Lieutenant Ratchak, sheerly through the example of his moral character and strong leadership, has created a family that endures his loss as though he's not gone at all. Sergeant Jalal, Ratchak's second-in-command and now replacement, issues orders and makes judgments as though Ratchak is some sort of invisible guardian deity. Then he himself behaved as if the lieutenant were merely out of sight, and that he was just passing on the lieutenant's orders as usual. It saved us. Following this scene, we come full circle with the beginning of the book, rehashing the violence against the skinnies and showing the mild fallout between Rico and one of his now subordinate squad leaders. They fight, and Rico loses, but gains the man's respect, essentially because Rico has shown he's willing to take a beating if that's necessary to wield authority. Throughout the book, we see this cycle again and again. Rico receiving some semblance of authority and routinely being handed the bill alongside his stripes, repeating again and again the essential narrative of authority being earned through self-sacrifice, as much as skill or merit. We also spend some time discussing the bug threat, which boils down to simple mathematics. The bugs lay eggs, and can do so endlessly, and while not even hatching all of them on a set timeline, essentially giving them an endless supply of fighters that would be impossible to exhaust given the current tactics. This makes a simple war of attrition, or an extermination, impossible. Every time we killed 1,000 bugs at a cost of 1 MI, it was a net victory for the bugs. We were learning, expensively, just how efficient a total communism can be when used by people actually adapted to it by evolution. The bug commissars didn't care any more about expending soldiers than we cared about expending ammo. Perhaps we could have figured this out about the bugs by noting the grief the Chinese hegemony gave the Russo-Anglo-American alliance. However, the trouble with lessons from history is that we usually read them best after falling flat on our chins. So, obviously, here we have in black and white the notorious allusion of Chinese communists to bugs, which has remained a derogation to this day. This strain of xenophobia goes deeper than simple racism, although that's clearly a foundational aspect of the issue at hand for many people, if not provably with Heinlein. Holistically, it's a powerful insinuation of the cultural evils of dogmatic Maoism in practice, and the sweeping, often communist, decolonization of Southeast Asia, which was an extremely hot and current topic at the time of Starship Troopers writing in the late 1950s. Without getting deeply into it, because 30 additional videos would be required to cover even a slice of this topic, the post-war period following the end of World War II sounded the death knell for European colonization of Southeast Asia. From 1946 to 1957 alone, the war-fatigued former superpowers of Europe lost most of their major colonies in the region. Britain lost British Burma, now Myanmar, Penang, Singapore, Malacca, Perak, Selangor, Negeri Sembilan, Pahang, Perlis, Kedah, Kelantan, Terengganu, Labuan, North Borneo, and Sarawak in what are now Malaysia, Brunei, and Singapore. The French lost all of their territory in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, those being Cochinchina, Annam, Tonkin, Cambodia, and Laos. The Dutch lost, literally, the Dutch East Indies, of Dutch East India Company and worldwide slavery fame. These losses didn't fully end European colonization of Southeast Asia, and, of course, into the 60s and 70s, white interference in the region would only increase with the onset of Cold War proxy conflicts and direct warfare carried out by various world powers, my own country included. This bug people mindset was inherent to not just critiques of Maoist and other East Asian strains of communism, but also justifications of violence against and interference with the people living under those governments. Without reservation, Heinlein's entire thesis behind Starship Troopers is the creation of a state military apparatus that can defend indefinitely against this derogatory caricature of Chinese communists. And further, to envision their cultural annihilation through concerted, focused military action against their hive mind leadership. Combined with Heinlein's nonfiction writings, this conclusion isn't really that much of a reach on my part. And, in fact, I would say it's the conclusion Heinlein desperately wants the reader to arrive at as well when it comes to describing his ideal enemy, the chiral antithesis to the new ideal presented in Rico and his moral education. Along with the new focus on capturing queen or brain bugs, we see the implementation of new tactics. The MI has learned to distinguish warriors from workers, and now is using a gas bombing technique to poison nests and seal them shut. This has mixed success, but has given the Terran Federation at least one win on the planet of Shill, which has been cleansed of bugs. following this discussion of tactics, we're provided glimpses into a top-secret planet called Sanctuary, where the Terran Federation conducts rest, refit, and resupply operations for its navy, and Cap troopers like Rico can take some R&R. This section provides a chance for Heinlein to do a few pages opining on selection of the fittest, here by saying even the most primitive life forms need to be dosed with ionizing radiation in order to mutate and grow stronger. It's, well, scientifically dubious, but serves to let Heinlein reassert his philosophy that all forms of life, simple or complex, must be ready for the incursion of other life forms or they'll be replaced. It's also where Heinlein wrote one of the most cracked paragraphs in the history of science fiction. But I can tell you what sort of planet it is. Like Earth, but retarded. If you think you didn't hear that right, he doubles down literally in the next sentence. Literally retarded. Like a kid who takes 10 years to learn to wave bye-bye and never does manage to master patty cake. It is a planet as near Earth as two planets can be. Same age according to the planetologists, and its star is the same age as the Sun and the same type. So say the astrophysicists. It has plenty of flora and fauna, the same atmosphere as Earth, near enough, and much the same weather. It even has a good-sized moon and Earth's exceptional tides. All this is to say, Earth moved in on Sanctuary and is rapidly terraforming it because all of its native fauna are completely unable to compete with the Terran Federation's introduced species. The chapter ends with a few pages of Rico ruminating over and then deciding to go to officer candidate school. The war has, off-screen, been going poorly for the Terran Federation, particularly in terms of troop numbers, and there's a dearth of officers because they keep gallantly getting themselves killed when missions go belly up. It should be said that Rico doesn't necessarily want to go career infantry, but feels obligated to, essentially, because it needs to get done and Cap troopers do what needs doing. That aside, his ruminations over going OCS include a sort of fascinating concern over why federal service doesn't guarantee a vote until after the end of service. Go career? Quite aside from that noise about a commission, did I want to go career? Why, I'd gone through all this to get my franchise, hadn't I? And if I went career, I was just as far away from the privilege of voting as if I had never enrolled. Because as long as you were still in uniform, you weren't entitled to vote, which is the way it should be, of course. Why, if they let roughnecks vote, the idiots might vote not to make a drop. Can't have that. This stands out to me mostly because it doesn't jive in the least with Heinlein's explicit returns to volunteerism throughout Starship Troopers. Cap troopers can already not jump throughout training and even into combat. It's one of the first things we learn about Cap troopers, in fact. But here it's suggested they might vote not to do something, and it just feels like either an afterthought or a mistake. Possibly it's even something of a joke by Rico lost in the medium, but it's jarring enough I think it's worth pointing out. Part 3.5 Officer Candidate School. The next chapter starts with Rico reuniting unexpectedly with his father, who has now also joined the military after the death of his wife in the bug terror attack. It's a nice, humanizing scene, but does little to drive the plot forward aside from making Rico late for OCS check-in. If you, for some reason, care about Rico's dad's gigantic company, he tells Rico that he has turned it over to an old guy named Morales to run and left about half the stock in a trust in Rico's name if he ever gets out of the military. Neat. Shortly after the end of this scene, Rico checks into OCS and officially becomes a Mustang in training. That's an officer who started his or her career as enlisted, mind you. Heinlein then writes this: I am not going to describe Officer Candidate School. This is a fucking lie. He proceeds to spend the next 33 pages describing Rico's time in OCS, which, in summation, is basically just a more schoolish version of boot camp. This is true both in the books and in real life. OCS is a real place, with different versions and locations for every branch of service, and it is where, without reservation, nominally intelligent men and women go to be transformed into, somehow, the stupidest, most reality-detached creatures in the military. Officers. Mostly, Rico's time in OCS is spent furthering his and the reader's education in history and moral philosophy. which is now a class you have to get good grades in or you'll be flushed back to the fleet without your promotion. Even kicked all the way out of the military, which is patently ridiculous and also possibly contradicted by other statements in the book, namely the odd permanent rank system, but I digress. If he gave you a down check, a board sat on you, questioning not merely whether you could be an officer, but whether you belonged in the army at any rank, no matter how fast you might be with weapons, deciding whether to give you extra instruction or just kick you out and let you be a civilian. We're essentially rehashing more of the same systems that are designed to root out the Hendrix element that might survive past boot camp, so I won't go into much of this section aside from to say it's basically the summation of all the philosophy we've talked about so far. Fun fact though, we find out that my birth year of 1987 should have been when, in Heinlein's alternate history, the white superpowers of the world, stylized as the Russo-Anglo-American Alliance, went to war with the Chinese hegemony. If you're watching this far, far after when I'm writing it in 2024, China has been and remains essentially Russia's only friend from that date to now. We learn more about the alternate histories of this universe as well, mostly that nobody can accurately describe how the Federation came into existence, though apparently the inciting incident was in Aberdeen, Scotland, of all places. I assume that possibly in the 1950s that might have been referential to something, but I couldn't immediately find a connection. Either way, there's a riot, and some veterans in the area get together and quash it, vigilante style. They hanged a few people, including 2 veterans, and decided not to let anyone but veterans on their committee. Just arbitrary at first. They trusted each other a bit. They didn't trust anyone else. What started as an emergency measure became constitutional practice in a generation or 2. The justification for this administrative system spreading and becoming worldwide practice is amazing, because it's both inarguable and totally worthless in the context of a fictional novel. Literally, it just works. We also receive the final word on voting, and in so doing, the essential capstone of Heinlein's philosophy. The vote is only given to those who have distinguished themselves through selfless service, because only they can be trusted to place the welfare of the whole above personal advantage. To vote is to wield authority. It is the supreme authority from which all other authority derives, such as mine to make your lives miserable once a day. Force, if you will. The franchise is force, naked and raw. The power of the rods and the axe. Whether it is exerted by 10 men or 10 billion, political authority is force. This speech is delivered by Major Reed, Rico's history and moral philosophy teacher, who is for all intents and purposes indistinguishable from his high school teacher of the same class, Mr. Dubois. They also serve the same essential function as a mouthpiece of Heinlein's philosophy as an educator of both Rico and the reader. Now, the power of the rods and the axe above is an invocation of the symbol of the fasces, which, yes, is the word from which fascism is derived. However, the symbol itself is considerably older and, much like the Hakenkreuz or swastika of Nazi Germany, the fasces was adopted for its historic symbolic associations with Rome. Specifically, the fasces was the symbol of authority for the Roman magistratus, a term that survives to this day as magistrate. Historically, the symbol of the fasces has represented law or legal authority and strength through unity, as well as the general presence of Roman-ness. Thus, it is present everywhere in Western architecture and symbolism, especially when the connotation is relative to law and order. In the United States, specifically, the massive bas-relief overlaying the entrance to the United States Supreme Court prominently features the fasces, and the symbol is built into the armrests of the Lincoln Memorial. To avoid digressing into a massively deep well of a topic, suffice to say I just wanted to point out that this use of the fasces as imagery is fully appropriate and not necessarily a direct incitement to fascism. Additionally, I'm not letting Heinlein off the hook, but I'm going to save the full interpretation of this for the end of the video. The sections following this are an outlaying of a ton of political standpoints and operational trivia that are important but don't need a lot of going into. We find out that the Terran Federation has a poll tax, which is an almost laughable restriction given you have to survive 2 years in the most dangerous military that's ever existed to vote. It's really just a way for Heinlein to crow about poll taxes, I know, but at this point in the novel he is absolutely exhausting with his departures from any sense of diegetic world building or narrative. He literally alludes to the era he was writing in as being full of people who'd balk at such a thing, so it's fairly clear it's just proselytizing at this point. We also find out the system is anti-bigotry in general, at least against things like race, color, creed, and sex. The system is also revolution-proof, because having a stratocracy of veterans means you'd have those who won't fight revolting against those who will. He further comes out against conscript armies and calls out the Korean War of the 1950s as a reference to why those are bad. I agree, by the way, but this point of the book has such angrily scribbled fan fiction energy that it ruins the meager bit of narrative pace the book had built up so far. If you read this at any age younger than maybe 30, I don't think you'd remember any of this, outside of it being boring. I mean, listen, the sentences I'm about to read are written in a sci-fi bug book. Without debating the usefulness or morality of Planned Parenthood, it may be verified by observation that any breed which stops its own increase gets crowded out by breeds which expand. Some human populations did so in Terran history, and other breeds moved in and engulfed them. I'll summarize all of this after the end of the book synopsis, and trust me, actual things will happen soon and we'll debog ourselves and be done before you know it. The philosophizing section ends and we get to a scene that would have probably been at the beginning of almost any other book. Rico and his classmates, ready to move to the final stages of training, are shown pips from other officers who've died and told little anecdotes about leadership and duty before being asked if they'll wear the pips. They're given a great deal of actually good advice, largely about trusting the men under your command and understanding you're not a hero, you're part of a unit. The scene actually made me a little emotional the first time I experienced it, and it's almost a whiplash from all the soapboxing a few scenes earlier. Or, he cradled the box in his hands, you could wear these. They have been worn 5 times, and the last 4 candidates to wear them have all failed of commission. Nothing dishonorable but pesky bad luck. Are you willing to take a swing at breaking the hoodoo? Turn them into good luck pips instead? I would have rather petted a shark, but I answered, all right, sir, I'll take a swing at it. From here, Rico is sent back to the fleet as a probationary officer, still a cadet but carrying the rank of lieutenant, to study under an experienced officer who will decide whether they'll pass muster. He's attached to the Taurs, a much larger ship than the one the Roughnecks are stationed on, and we re-engage with the actually interesting parts of Starship Troopers, if you're not a poli-sci or philosophy wonk. We talk about spaceships and spaceship engines and hot Navy ladies telling you good luck before they shoot you out of their ships in a, I hope Heinlein realized this, hilariously on-the-nose birth allegory. We also get some interesting interpersonal drama that plays out between command staff as an explainer for how the various military branches stack their ranks amongst each other. We further get more information about the everybody works, everybody fights mentality that drives the MI, but it's mostly just rehashing what we already know. Heinlein spends some time here trying to handwave the clear disadvantages of risking specialized individuals with every drop. While a few MI are on desk jobs, you will always find that they are shy, an arm or a leg, or some such. These are the ones, the Sergeant Hose and the Colonel Nielsen's, who refuse to retire. And they really ought to count twice since they release able-bodied MI by filling jobs which require fighting spirit but not physical perfection. They do work that civilians can't do, or we would hire civilians. Civilians are like beans. You buy them as needed for any job which merely requires skill and savvy. But you can't buy fighting spirit. This explanation works in the real world as well as in Heinlein's novel, but only to a degree. There simply aren't civilians doing a lot of the work that needs to be done on these military vessels, which we've seen throughout the book in various descriptions of their onboard duties. So if you lose those troopers, then you lose cooks, mechanics, electricians, etc., and can't replace them because, obviously, you're in space and very, very far from friendly resupply. To say less of losing highly specialized military units like officers who can be lived without, but are still impossibly difficult to train up under the extremely high standards given by Heinlein. The scarcity of officers got steadily worse as the war wore on. Because the casualty rate is always highest among officers, and the MI never commissions a man simply to fill a vacancy. In the long run, each boot regiment must supply its own share of officers, and the percentage can't be raised without lowering the standards. The strike force in the tours needed 13 officers, 6 platoon leaders, 2 company commanders and 2 deputies, and a strike force commander staffed by a deputy and an adjutant. What it had was 6. And me. This leads to a situation described even in the narrative where other units will try to, essentially, Shanghai NCOs while they're on leave to send them to OCS. It's absolutely nuts and without reservation an unsustainable system. The answer Heinlein gives to that is, essentially, be fruitful and multiply as stated above, followed by a good amount of fuck you it works. There's a sort of running gag I didn't get into earlier, but it pops up again and again in the history and moral philosophy courses, where someone will be charged with proving some philosophical concept that is absolutely crucial to the Terran Federation existing. And they will, but only off-screen. And they never share these reality-warping proofs of intangible philosophical concepts. It's awesome. But just to hammer home how ridiculous this setup is, Rico, for the duration of the penultimate chapter of this novel, has basically 3 jobs in the middle of a war. He's a full-time infantryman, a full-time college student by way of OCS, and also a full-time ordnance and armor mechanic. This is on top of secondary duties, which I will not fully list but include mail censoring, a real job, various B-billet officer oversight duties, and even refereeing events on ship. You see where this left me. 10 hours O&A, 3 hours math, meals an hour and a half, personal 1 hour, military fiddle work 1 hour, George 2 hours, sleep 8 hours, total 26 and a half hours. The ship wasn't even on the 25-hour sanctuary day. Once we left, we went on Greenwich Standard in the universal calendar. Obviously, the civilian contractor contingent isn't doing much, if anything, to alleviate the schedule of a junior officer, of all things, much less any other infantrymen on board these ships. I bring this up for the reasons stated prior, but essentially, Heinlein does this again and again throughout Starship Troopers. He provides an idealized view of something that is described as being in every way better than the current, as of 1957, standards, but is then immediately struck with the obvious challenges that fix must either overcome or will create through its implementation. He goes, at most, a couple layers deep into the fix, but then inevitably retreats into stopgaps and off-screen assurances that hand-wave the inherent and often insurmountable issues created or required by his solutions. It's a critical problem both with the novel's construction and the slipshod construction of the philosophy he's presenting. Returning to Rico, he's actually relieved of some of his work, largely only the work that solely benefits him, that of his studies, and told to get more sleep and exercise. And then, finally, we go back to P, but not actually back to P in the novel. We're going there for the first time, and with Rico in charge of some troopers. The mission, get a brain bug, both proving the things exist and providing a path to ending the conflict. This strategy was simple, and, I guess, logical, if we could afford the losses. Let the bugs come up, meet them and kill them on the surface. Let them keep on coming up. Don't bomb their holes, don't gas their holes, let them out. And after a while, a day, 2 days, a week, if we really did have overwhelming force, they would stop coming up. This is the part of the book that I wish was more the whole of the book. It's exciting. There are a ton of new, interesting concepts introduced that I actually give a shit about, like the Biowar Corps and mapping ESPers. The whole point of the operation is to fight the bugs in essentially the same way as on Klendathu, but with a much larger force dedicated to staying above ground and thinning out the bugs over time so they can finally go down and capture a high-value target with minimal resistance. Rico spends the operation commanding a platoon under the watch of Captain Blackstone, who's been his supervisor since he got dropped to the tours. It's a good series of scenes, taking up the last chunk of the novel's penultimate chapter and returning to most all of the lessons on soldiering and leadership that Rico has learned since joining the military. He listens to command, but he also interprets orders as necessary. He lets his NCOs do their job, but hops in to deliver orders and guidance. We even have, as promised earlier, the live-fire version of the Hendrick incident. Major Landry said crisply, "Ground your platoon." I gulped and started to argue, then cut in the all-hands circuit. "First platoon, blackguards, ground and freeze." This is all during the coolest scene in the goddamn book, where a special talent, a person with extrasensory perception, makes a stereoscopic map of the tunnels under the planet's surface just by listening to the ground. He's the reason Rico had to order his unit to freeze. He simply needed to hear better. Following this, the operation continues for a while, and we finally see another interesting aspect of this setting in action: hypnosis, which is never really gone into in any specifics, but seems to be highly effective. Rico is given a therapeutic command to sleep by Captain Blackstone and does for a little over an hour. As a side note, I've seen some speculation while researching this book that actually everybody's hypnotized by the Terran Federation and there is no such thing as free will under that government. Or such little free will that it basically doesn't exist. With even my limited knowledge on Heinlein, I'm going to say that doesn't make much sense, given the fact that Rico and other characters all seem expressly aware of the presence of hypnosis, and it's not used outside of therapeutic contexts. It also doesn't explain how murder or any bad behavior could occur, really, unless the Terran Federation intends for all that to happen to some degree, which is as pointless as it is ridiculous. It also goes against the meta-narrative of selfless sacrifice that's repeated ad nauseum throughout the book. But following the hypnosis, the mission commences, and Rico eventually falls into what he initially thinks is a bug ambush when the ground falls out from underneath him. He quickly decides this is, in fact, a feint, as he'd likely be dead if there were any warrior bugs along with the rattling mass that had burst up from the ground. Other troopers report the same thing happening across their area of operations, and Rico discovers a handful of his men have disappeared into the tunnels. He decides to go down and find his missing men, and the rest of his platoon fall in behind. I had Kuna leave 2 men at the hole to cover our rear, one on the floor of the tunnel, one at the surface level. Then I led them down the tunnel, the second had followed, moving as fast as possible. Which wasn't fast, as the roof of the tunnel was right over our heads. Rico et al. Delved down into the bug city as it crumbles around them, weakened by the surface barrage from the naval vessels in orbit over the planet as much by the frantic digging of the bugs. Rico finds his platoon sergeant holding the brain bug hostage, its warrior bugs unable to approach out of fear of literally killing themselves by damaging their own brain. Rico and his subordinates kill the other bugs, feel a moment of exaltation, and then Rico is hit by a giant fucking chunk of ceiling rock and knocked out for the duration of the mission. He wakes up some time later, safe in the medical ward of the Argonne. Operation Royalty, the attack on P, was largely considered a success, with 6 brain bugs being captured, and we find out that Rico's old training sergeant, Zim, was the one who captured the bug. Very cool. After that, Rico spends a month in sickbay, and we get the closest thing this novel was ever going to give us to a happy ending. He passes officer school, Zim gets a promotion to brevet captain, and Rico's own father ends up working for him, bringing the sub-narrative of military heritage full circle by literally placing Rico over his biological father in rank and under his first surrogate father in this new system. Also very cool. I felt excited. I had my 2 dearest wishes in one package, posted to my old outfit, and while my father was still there too. The rest of this chapter is a sort of shameless fangirling over military history trivia, where the names of all the Terran Federation ships correlate to real battles and soldiers. We get a special nod to Ramon Magsaysay, who I'll mention because Rico says he should be included as one of the names on the smaller ships, all named for soldiers of yore. We also find out that Rico's native language is Tagalog. Very, very cool. The final chapter of Starship Troopers is the shortest, an addendum of sorts that feels almost Elysian in its awkward absurdity. And I have to hand it to the Verhoeven adaptation here for managing to accidentally sum up my annoyance with this final bit of Heinlein's novel. It begins with 4 religious quotes, those being Genesis 4:9, Matthew 12:12, Matthew 18:12, and the Quran, Surah 5, verse 32. The last is quoted as, "In the name of God, the Beneficent, the Merciful, Whoso saveth the life of one, it shall be as if he had saved the life of all mankind. If the selfless sacrifice motive hasn't been hammered home yet, it never will be. Each year we gain a little. You have to keep a sense of proportion. In this final chapter, Rico is now an experienced old man officer in the eyes of his men and training up a new cadet, candidate Jimmy Bearpaw. Rico describes Jimmy's ancestors as scalp hunting, so who knows what their lineage might be. Rico's father is his platoon sergeant, now Captain Jalal is retired and has been fitted with prosthetic legs, and the war seems to be going well. They're all buttoning up for another drop, this time to occupy Clendathu for good. And we see Rico still gets the shakes, bringing us full circle to the first words of the book. Our last line in Starship Troopers is a snatch of the refrain from The Ballad of Roger Young, the eponymous Medal of Honor winner for whom Rico's ship is named, to the everlasting glory of the infantry. Part 4. Fascism and the Failure of Satire. I'm going to begin the last section of this video with two assertions. The first is that, in no way do I believe Robert Anson Heinlein was a fascist. The second is that I believe Starship Troopers might be the most thorough game plan for fascism put to paper since the Fascist Manifesto itself. Heinlein was, by all accounts, very much a libertarian, especially by the political standards of 1950s America. There's too much material on Heinlein for me to be fully exhaustive in my defense of that fact, but by every standard that exists, Heinlein was so outspoken he would very likely have simply said he was a fascist if he believed it. That said, the definition of fascism is amongst the most flexible in the modern political lexicon of 2024, the year I'm writing this. To the point it is simultaneously an invective, a description, an essentialization, a slur, and, for some, a bit of a joke. My definition, at its simplest, is that fascism is a social organization created to serve and protect an individual society from the threats that society perceives as most dangerous to it. Summum bonum ex summa potestas. Supreme good from supreme power. To establish fascism is to draw a circle and stand within it, labeling all within the circle us and all without them. From there, you merely need to ensure the line stays firm, the us stays us, and the them stays out there. It seems like a simple equation at first blush, but once you start adding variables to the mix, you find it evolving quite quickly into the old familiar forms. When us gets hungry, gets crowded, the line must move to encircle better grazing. When they are defeated, a new they arrives. And always, there is a constant imperfection inside the line. A non-us that must be identified, named, and drawn out for the good of us. Invariably, you move toward authoritarianism, civil distrust, and violence. I've hardly been academically exhaustive in my creation of that definition, but I've found it works to describe and predict fascism in its many myriad forms since the nouveau revitalization of the term by Giovanni Gentile at the turn of the 20th century. Nazis, Stalinists, Mussolini's fascists, and even the America First variant here at home all fall fairly cleanly within the definition. And if it works, why fix it? Which brings me back to that statement by Verhoeven. It's a society that works. This is the true allure of his film, writ large on the silver screen and, more importantly, not writ at all, which makes it far more accessible to the common man. He, unwittingly or possibly uncaringly, brought the heart of Heinlein's work to the masses and said, "Here, what do you think?" And people thought it was great. They still do. You see, Heinlein isn't a fascist in the acute sense. He didn't draw his circle around a specific country or state or ethnicity. No, he drew it around us, me and you and everybody you've ever known. Heinlein approached fascism incidentally, because at a certain point, we all have a capacity for fascism. In his case, it was the fear of an entire political ideology, one he believed would span the globe and annihilate any chance for human liberty on Earth. And that's a fair fear to have, regardless of whether it's untrue, because reality is often an unsteady cure for fear. This is common to the human condition. People experience fear and put up their walls, and not always against human threats. We strive as a race to annihilate entire genetic families of bacteria, virus, and even other slightly more complex organisms. We don't even see them as distinct or alive, because they are, in a non-metaphorical sense, beneath us. Much like the bugs of Heinlein's troopers, these things represent an unyielding natural threat that cannot be engaged with diplomatically, which Heinlein, in his fear, saw as a trait inherent to all communists, particularly those of a Maoist heritage. This is the allure of fascism, and what's represented by that symbol of fascism, the rods and axe. A unified collective that cannot be easily broken once bound, their common defense symbolized in the axe head. The fasces is an icon that represents so much of what makes a human society. Technology, cooperation, a common education, and generations of heritage. It's not a fascist symbol, but rather the symbol the fascists chose to idealize because it is the perfect symbol under which to unite the terrified. And it is the symbol and the ideal to which Heinlein returned because he was terrified. Not the gibbering terror of a child, but the creeping, smoldering dread of the adult. A man who wrote for himself and anyone who'd listen a story about the sort of society that could raise the sort of soldier who would always protect what he held most dear: his freedom. Talking about Heinlein's novel during his interview in Salmon's The Making of Starship Troopers, Verhoeven amends his description of the Terran Federation from crypto-fascist to benign fascist. This is all part of the society that works talk that comes up again and again in both The Making of Starship Troopers and discussions of the adapted novel. And that's important, because to really send this home, the society does work. Certain subsections of the political sciences, particularly on the left, create first a moral framework for actions and then choose inaction when the perfect moral conditions aren't realized. They cannot do until the ideal conditions arise, and until then, they simply sit back and moralize to their heart's content. Verhoeven's adaptation provides a perfect example of this petty moralizing in play. These commentators refuse to see the holistic nature of what's before them, and focus only on the aspects which don't conform to their moral sensibilities, which creates a blind spot they can articulate over and over, but for some reason, none of them ever pursue deeper. Why don't the fascists understand they're the butt of the joke? Because they're not. Because they don't care there even is a joke. The failure of satire lies nearly always in its inability to articulate motivations apart from actions. It is pissy, pedantic, self-involved, and masturbatory in all the worst ways nearly every time. Satire is the icing without the cake. It is the punchline without the setup. It requires not an audience willing to laugh, but rather an agreeable disposition and a desire to sneer. It is first its self-importance, second its self-defense, and lastly, if at all, its effect. And always, 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 it is the only school of comedy where the comedian feels not merely justified, but exalted in explaining the joke. Fascism does not appeal to fascists. It appeals to people who become fascists. People who live in this broken, unfair, and often awful world we all share, and to whom a society that works is often a dream. Heinlein, specifically, offers a society that rewards not martial prowess, nor mental acuity, nor material wealth. No, it requires only self-sacrifice, and not even always that. And people sacrifice themselves every day in this world, for their children, their jobs, their countries, and see nothing for it. Who, when offered a world where that sacrifice would protect them, their livelihoods, their rights, their property, their families, their children, would turn such an offer down without reservation. Robert Anson Heinlein was not a fascist, but he recreated fascism from whole cloth out of the two most human emotions, love and fear. Fear that his freedoms and the freedoms of all mankind would be obliterated by an alien political system that seemed antithetical to his continued existence, and had the nuclear capability to end the Earth over that insurmountable difference. And love, of not just his freedoms, but of the selfless sacrifice countless young people had made in the armed forces to protect those freedoms, and of the best aspects of humanity that bled through all that misery and pain to carry humanity to the next sunrise. Verhoeven, in his petulant hubris, thought he could ensnare the dream of a society he refused to understand and make a mockery of it, and failed. Decades passed, and Helldivers 2 reapproached the same topic, made the same failures, and became a rallying point for the same disaffected, feckless, scared, and drifting individuals Heinlein believed would be whipped into shape given the opportunities of his Terran Federation. Generations of young men who kept arriving at the same point again and again and again, that there's a struggle out there, an enemy, a cause, a reason to fight that will unite them, protect them, and make them whole. And, of course, you can keep making the same joke about them again and again and again and explaining it again and again and again. But never forget, it'll be hard to keep laughing when they've slit your throat.
Oh, they've got no time for glory in the infantry. Oh, they've got no use for praises loudly sung. But in every soldier's heart, in all the infantry, shines the name of Roger Young. But in ambush lay a company of riflemen, just grenades against machine guns in the blue. But in ambush tells us one of 20 riflemen volunteered to meet his doom. Volunteer, Roger Young, fought and died for the men he marched among. In the everlasting annals of the infantry, knows the last deed of Private Roger Young. On the island of New Georgia in the Solomons stands a simple wooden cross alone to tell that beneath the silent cross